On my 30th birthday, my parents took me to a Michelin star steakhouse just to tell me I was adopted. My mother smiled as she said they only kept me around for the state subsidies, and now that I was no longer useful, they were officially cutting me out of everything. I did not cry. I simply looked at her and said, "It is funny you mention that because I found my birth family 9 months ago, and they are sitting 5 tables behind you." When my mother slowly turned around, she had no idea her entire world was about to collapse. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who severely underestimated you. I am Gwen, and I am 35 years old now, but the night that shattered my entire understanding of reality happened exactly 5 years ago. We were sitting in a secluded private alcove at one of the most exclusive and intimidating steakhouses in downtown Chicago. The ambient noise of clinking crystal glasses and soft jazz floated through the room, masking the absolute cruelty unfolding at our table. Beatrice, the woman I had called mother my entire life, finished the last sip of her expensive Cabernet and neatly wiped the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin. Without a single trace of emotion on her perfectly lifted face, she slid a heavy leather billfold across the pristine white tablecloth directly toward me. "Pay your portion, Gwen," she said, her tone as casual and dismissive as if she were commenting on the weather outside. The bill was for over $500, mostly consisting of the imported wine and Wagyu beef she and my father had consumed. "Consider it your final financial contribution to this family." I stared at the leather folder, confused by the sudden icy shift in her demeanor. That is when she dropped the facade she had meticulously maintained for 3 decades. She leaned forward, allowing the dim restaurant lighting to catch the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, and delivered the words that were meant to completely destroy me. "You are adopted," she stated plainly, a chilling smirk playing on her lips. "We only kept you around for the adoption subsidies and the monthly state benefits. You were quite the little paycheck when you were younger, but those funds dried up a long time ago. You are simply no longer useful to us. So tomorrow morning our lawyers are filing the paperwork to officially cut you out of the family trust. You will not see a single dime of our wealth." Harrison, the man I grew up desperately trying to impress, did not even bother to look me in the eye. He swirled his aged scotch, the ice clinking loudly in the quiet tension of our alcove. "Let us be brutally honest here," he added, his voice dripping with unmistakable condescension. "You were never really one of us anyway. Look at you. You are just a glorified calculator, a forensic accountant. What kind of pathetic career is that for someone in our social circle? Your sister Courtney is building a legitimate and glamorous lifestyle empire, while you punch numbers into a spreadsheet in some dreary cubicle. We simply cannot have someone of your low caliber and mediocre ambition dragging down our prestigious family name." The comparison to Courtney was nothing new to me. It had been the bitter soundtrack of my entire childhood. Courtney was their biological daughter, their absolute golden child, who received brand new luxury cars, fully funded European vacations, and designer wardrobes. Meanwhile, I was forced to work exhausting night shifts at a local diner just to afford my community college textbooks. They had always treated me like a burdensome employee rather than a daughter. Whenever family photos were taken for their country club newsletters, I was conveniently placed in the back, or asked to step out of the frame entirely so they could get a shot of just the real family. But hearing them openly and shamelessly admit that my entire existence in their home was nothing more than a calculated financial transaction felt like a physical blow to my chest. They sat there waiting for my reaction. They fully expected tears. They expected me to beg for their love, to plead for my place in the will, to promise I would be better and try harder. That is exactly what the old Gwen would have done. The desperate approval-seeking girl who spent her 20s working 80-hour weeks just to earn a single passing compliment from Harrison would have shattered into a million pieces right there in the steakhouse. But that girl was gone. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice, or give them the satisfaction of causing a public scene. I took a slow, calming breath and reached into my designer purse, a bag I had purchased with my own hard-earned money. I bypassed my personal debit card and pulled out a heavy matte black corporate credit card. I placed it smoothly into the leather billfold and handed it directly to the waiter who was hovering nervously near our table, trying to avoid making eye contact. "Put the entire table on this," I told the waiter, offering him a warm and polite smile. "It will be my treat for their final meal." Beatrice scoffed loudly, staring at the black card with a mixture of deep confusion and greedy disdain. Harrison slammed his scotch glass down onto the table so hard that the amber liquid spilled over the rim and stained the white tablecloth. "A black card." Harrison laughed harshly, his face flushing red with sudden and explosive anger. "Do not try to play wealthy with us, Gwen. You work in a glorified accounting cubicle. You probably stole that company card from one of your superiors just to look impressive tonight. You are committing corporate fraud right in front of us. I play golf with the senior partners at your firm. I am calling your boss right now to tell him exactly what kind of miserable thief he has working for him." "That is incredibly funny. You mentioned my boss, Harrison." I leaned across the table, keeping my voice perfectly level, so the wealthy patrons at the adjacent booths could not hear, though I desperately wanted them to. "But what is even funnier is that I found my birth family 9 months ago, and they are sitting exactly 5 tables behind you." Beatrice froze. The wine glass she was lifting stopped midway to her mouth. She turned around slowly, the smug satisfaction melting off her face like wax held to a flame. From the shadows of the elevated dining tier, 2 figures stood up. Diana and Jonathan, my biological parents. They did not look like people you could push around. Jonathan wore a charcoal bespoke suit that commanded the room without trying, and Diana possessed an icy, terrifying elegance. They walked down the shallow carpeted steps toward our alcove, their eyes locked entirely on the 2 people who had made my childhood a living nightmare. Beatrice actually dropped her jaw. She looked back at me, then at the approaching couple, the color draining from her cheeks until her heavy blush looked painted on a ghost. Harrison shifted in his leather booth, suddenly looking very small inside his expensive sport coat. Diana did not yell. She did not create a theatrical scene. She walked right up to the edge of our table, reached into her designer clutch, and pulled out a thick folded document. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she dropped it directly onto Beatrice's plate, right on top of her half-eaten Wagyu steak. "That is a certified bank statement." Beatrice Diana said, her voice dropping the temperature in the alcove by 10 degrees. "It shows a $3 million closed adoption trust. $3 million that Jonathan and I placed in an irrevocable fund 25 years ago. It was explicitly meant to ensure Gwen had a top-tier life, a debt-free education, and a highly secure future." I watched Harrison dart his eyes toward the exit. He knew exactly what that paper was. Diana leaned forward, resting her perfectly manicured hands on the table, trapping Beatrice in her piercing gaze. "When we finally reconnected with our daughter 9 months ago, we expected to find a woman who had been given every advantage in the world. Instead, we found out she had to work 3 minimum wage jobs just to afford her used textbooks at a state college. We found out she was denied basic student loans because her credit was inexplicably tied to failing real estate ventures. The truth hung in the air, suffocating and absolute. For my entire life, I had believed I was a massive financial burden. I remembered scrubbing the greasy floors of a 24-hour diner at 2 in the morning, my back aching just so I could pay for my accounting certification exams. I remembered begging Harrison for a simple $50 loan for groceries, only to be told that I needed to learn the hard value of a dollar. All the while, Courtney was driving a brand new Mercedes and taking fully funded European vacations on my dime. Beatrice and Harrison had not just favored their biological daughter. They had actively stolen my life to fund hers. "You drained it," Jonathan added, stepping up beside his wife, his voice vibrating with barely contained fury. "You drained every single cent of that trust over the last 2 decades. You stole from a child to fund your lavish country club memberships and your failing business ventures. You took our money, treated our daughter like a heavy burden, and now you have the absolute audacity to try and discard her because the well finally ran dry." Beatrice stammered, her hands shaking violently as she desperately grabbed the grease-stained bank statement. She tried to shove the document into her purse, muttering a string of disjointed, pathetic excuses about inflation and the rising costs of childcare. She looked nothing like the proud, cruel matriarch who had slid that dinner check to me just moments ago. She looked exactly like a rat caught in a trap. Harrison, however, chose a very different tactic. His initial shock instantly morphed into explosive cornered rage. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, drawing the attention of the entire dining room. "This is harassment," Harrison barked, his voice booming over the soft jazz music playing from the ceiling speakers. He aggressively waved his arms in the air, signaling the restaurant maitre d' and a pair of large security guards standing near the front entrance. "Get over here right now. These people are harassing my wife and me. I want them thrown out into the street immediately." The security guards began marching toward our table, their expressions grim and strictly professional. Harrison pointed a shaking finger right at my face, a triumphant, malicious gleam returning to his eyes as he prepared to have my biological parents and me publicly humiliated and dragged out of the building. Before the security guards could even lay a hand on my chair, the heavy mahogany doors of our private dining room burst open with a deafening crack. The thick wood slammed against the wall, causing the crystal sconces to rattle loudly. The two burly security guards stopped dead in their tracks, completely confused by the sudden violent intrusion. Everyone in the alcove turned to look. Standing in the doorway, breathing heavily and looking completely unhinged, was my sister Courtney. The golden child had arrived. She was wearing a custom silk gown meant for a red carpet, but her usually flawless blonde hair was disheveled and her expensive makeup was visibly smudged from crying. Right behind her, looking deeply stressed and visibly exhausted, was her husband Andre. Andre was a highly successful venture capitalist, sharp, intelligent, and usually the calmest person in any room. Tonight, however, he looked like a man who had just watched a train derail in slow motion. Courtney did not even register the bizarre scene she had just walked into. She completely ignored the security guards standing awkwardly near the table. She ignored Diana and Jonathan, who were watching her with cold calculation. She did not even notice the bank statement sitting on top of her mother's steak. Her furious, tear-filled eyes locked onto me like a heat-seeking missile. "Make her leave!" Courtney shrieked, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "Harrison, get her out of here right now. She ruined everything. She ruined my entire life." Beatrice instantly shifted from a cornered rat to a fiercely protective mother. She leaped out of her booth, rushing to Courtney's side and wrapping her arms around her golden child. "What happened, darling?" Beatrice cooed desperately, trying to soothe the hysterical woman. "What did Gwen do to you?" "She froze my accounts," Courtney sobbed hysterically, her voice echoing out into the main dining room of the restaurant. "Every single one of my company credit cards is declining. I have 500 VIP guests standing in the ballroom for my lifestyle brand launch party, and the caterers are threatening to pack up the food. The florists are literally ripping the centerpieces off the tables because the final payments bounced. The open bar was shut down 20 minutes ago. It is a complete public relations nightmare, and it is all her fault. She did this out of pure jealousy." Harrison turned back to me, his face purple with a lethal mix of rage and panic. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the silverware jump. "Turn the cards back on right now, Gwen," he demanded, his voice a vicious snarl. "I do not care what kind of petty accounting trick you pulled at your firm to freeze her business accounts. You will unlock them this second, or I will make sure you spend the next 10 years in federal prison for financial sabotage." It was almost poetic. Just 10 minutes ago, Harrison was mocking me for being a glorified calculator and an embarrassment to the family name. Now the golden child was having a complete mental breakdown in a Michelin star restaurant because her entire glamorous lifestyle had hit a brick wall, and apparently the only person who could fix it was the glorified calculator they had just disowned. For my entire life, I had been forced to absorb Courtney's tantrums. Whenever she failed a class, she blamed me for distracting her. Whenever she crashed one of her luxury cars, she claimed I had parked mine too close to the driveway. Harrison and Beatrice always validated her delusions, punishing me for her mistakes, to ensure Courtney never had to experience a single moment of accountability. They expected me to fold right now. They expected me to pull out my phone log into the firm portal and frantically beg the fraud department to release the funds just to stop Harrison from yelling at me. I did not flinch. I did not reach for my phone. I simply sat there perfectly still, letting the silence stretch out and watching Courtney dramatically sob into her mother's shoulder. I bypassed Harrison's ridiculous threats and Courtney's hysterical crying entirely. Instead, I shifted my gaze past them and looked directly at Andre. He was standing a few feet behind his wife, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tuxedo trousers, looking completely drained. He had always been an outsider to this family dynamic just like me, but he had immense wealth and influence, so Harrison and Beatrice tolerated him. They loved his venture capital money even if they secretly despised sharing the spotlight with him. Andre, I said, my voice completely steady, cutting through Courtney's crying. You are a smart man. You analyze data for a living. Do you honestly believe a mid-level forensic accountant has the authority to maliciously freeze millions of dollars in corporate credit simply out of jealousy? Andre frowned, his brow furrowing as he looked at me. The panic in his eyes shifted into something much sharper, something like sudden realization. He looked at Courtney, who was still screaming about the caterers, and then back to me. I slowly reached into my designer purse. I did not pull out my phone to unlock the accounts. Instead, I pulled out a sleek silver tablet. I tapped the screen once, pulling up the encrypted file I had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously verifying. The bright light of the screen illuminated my face as I rested my hand on the table, waiting for Andre to take the final step toward the truth. Unlock the accounts right now, Gwen. Courtney slammed her perfectly manicured hands onto the edge of the dining table, knocking over an empty crystal wine glass. It rolled off the edge and shattered against the hardwood floor, but she did not even blink. You are completely ruining my life. I have over 500 VIP guests standing in the grand ballroom for my lifestyle brand launch party, and the caterers are threatening to pack up the food. Just log into whatever stupid portal you use and fix it. You always fix my messes. Just like when you covered my credit card bills in college so Dad would not find out. Just do your job and fix my cards so I can go back to my party. Harrison immediately chimed in, leaning across the table with a menacing scowl. You heard your sister, Harrison growled, his voice thick with unearned authority. Stop playing these pathetic jealous games and do as you are told. You have caused enough embarrassment for one evening. Fix her accounts and then get out of our sight. Beatrice was nodding vigorously, stroking Courtney's arm and shooting me a look of absolute disgust. How could you be so petty? Beatrice sneered. Your sister is trying to build an empire and you are throwing a childish tantrum with her money. I looked at Courtney. Her face was flushed red, her expensive mascara was slightly smudged, and she looked absolutely ridiculous throwing a temper tantrum in the middle of a Michelin star restaurant. For my entire life, I had been heavily conditioned to jump the second Courtney panicked. I was the designated family fixer, the invisible safety net expected to quietly clean up her academic failures, her minor car accidents, and her massive shopping debts. Harrison and Beatrice had always demanded my complete submission to ensure their golden child never had to experience a single moment of real consequence. They fully expected me to fold right now. They expected me to pull out my phone, log into the banking portal, and frantically release the funds just to appease them. But looking at her now, I felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no obligation, no lingering desire to protect the people who had just coldly admitted to using me for government subsidies. I slowly shifted my gaze away from my screaming sister and locked eyes with Andre. He was a brilliant man, a highly successful self-made venture capitalist who managed billions in assets. He had married into this family 2 years ago, and I had always quietly wondered how long it would take for a man of his sharp intellect to realize he had married into a den of polished parasites. Tonight was clearly his lucky night. Andre, I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of the hysterical family panic Courtney was desperately trying to incite. We have met at tedious holiday dinners and forced family gatherings, but we have never actually been formally introduced in a professional capacity. My name is Gwen, and I am the lead independent forensic auditor contracted by your venture capital firm last month. The blood completely drained from Andre's face. He blinked, staring at me as if I had just spoken to him in a dead language. He took a slow step away from his frantic wife. You are the lead auditor from Sterling and Vance? He asked, his voice dropping to a shocked whisper. I nodded slowly, maintaining steady eye contact. You hired our firm to conduct a comprehensive blind audit of your entire investment portfolio. You specifically requested a third party outside of your usual financial network because you suspected massive irregularities within your subsidiary holdings. You wanted someone who could not be bought or influenced. You just did not realize the senior auditor assigned to your highly classified case happened to be the woman your wife routinely treats like a personal servant. Courtney let out an exaggerated theatrical scoff, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. Who cares what stupid accounting firm you work for? She yelled, completely oblivious to the gravity of the situation. You are my sister, and you froze my company cards out of pure spite because you have always been jealous of my success. I am the CEO of a lifestyle brand and you are a nobody. Unlock my cards right now or I will have Andre sue you for everything you own. I did not even look at her. I kept my eyes locked entirely on her husband. I did not freeze your cards out of spite, Courtney. I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority. I froze them because it is legally mandated by federal financial regulations. I held out the sleek silver tablet directly toward Andre, completely ignoring Courtney, who tried to snatch it out of the air. Andre stepped forward and took the device from my hands. His fingers, which were usually so steady, were trembling slightly as his eyes dropped to the illuminated screen. Your wife's corporate accounts triggered an automated Tier 1 fraud alert on our systems at exactly 8 o'clock this evening. I explained clearly, ensuring every word landed with devastating precision. The algorithm flagged multiple high-risk transactions that blatantly violated the core parameters of your venture capital funding agreement. When I reviewed the flagged data, I did not manually freeze the accounts to ruin a launch party. The system automatically locked them down due to suspected egregious embezzlement. Andre stared at the glowing screen, his eyes darting frantically back and forth as he processed the dense financial data logs I had compiled over the past 3 weeks. Courtney tried to lean over his shoulder to see what he was looking at, whining about how unfair I was being, but Andre abruptly yanked the tablet out of her line of sight. He did not say a single comforting word to his wife. He did not defend her. He just kept scrolling through the files, his breathing growing heavy and dangerously uneven as the horrific reality of the numbers began to set in. $240,000. Andre's voice broke the heavy silence of the dining room. He did not look up from the tablet. His tone was eerily calm, stripped of all its usual warmth. $315,000, $500,000. Courtney stopped her fake sobbing. She wiped at her mascara-stained cheeks, looking nervously at her parents. Andre, what are you talking about? She asked, her voice trembling with genuine fear now. Andre began pacing a short line across the carpeted floor, his eyes glued to the financial logs I had meticulously decrypted. He read the names of the recipient accounts aloud. Horizon Holdings, Pinnacle Property Management, Vanguard Commercial Developments. He stopped pacing and finally looked up, locking his eyes onto Harrison. Those are not lifestyle brand suppliers, Harrison. Those are your failing real estate shell companies. Harrison swallowed hard. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his starched white collar. He opened his mouth to speak, but Andre cut him off instantly. For the past 5 years, you told me your lifestyle brand was rapidly expanding, Andre said, turning his burning gaze back to his wife. You told me the venture capital investments I funneled into your business were paying for overseas manufacturing facilities and high-end retail spaces. But there is no brand, is there, Courtney? There are no manufacturing facilities. You have been systematically bleeding my investment portfolios dry and wiring every single cent directly into your father's bankrupt commercial properties. Courtney's face went completely pale. She reached out with a trembling hand, but Andre took a sharp step backward. It was just a temporary bridge loan, she stammered, her voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. Daddy was having some minor cash flow problems with his commercial leases. We were going to pay it all back, Andre, I swear. We just needed to move some liquidity around to protect the family assets. I watched as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked together in Andre's mind. The action-based backstory of his entire marriage laid bare in cold, hard numbers. He looked at the tablet and then looked at the 3 people who had claimed to love him. My biological parents, Diana and Jonathan, remained perfectly still in the background, acting as silent witnesses to the absolute destruction of my abusers. Their presence only amplified the suffocating pressure in the room. A bridge loan. Andre repeated, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. You have been moving this money since the exact month we returned from our honeymoon. I remember that month clearly. You practically begged me to let you manage the boutique investment tier of my firm. You said you wanted to prove you were a true business partner capable of handling serious capital. And when your father nearly lost his downtown office buildings 2 years ago, you suddenly needed a massive capital injection to secure a warehouse for your fake beauty products. You took my money, and you took my trust, and you funneled both directly into the pockets of the people who raised you to be a thief. Andre let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed against the mahogany walls of the private alcove. You did not use that money for a warehouse. You used it to pay off Harrison's default notices. You paid off his outstanding corporate tax liens and his delinquent commercial mortgages. You have been treating my venture capital firm like your own personal slush fund. You forged vendor invoices. You fabricated supply chain reports. You stood in our kitchen looking me dead in the eye and lied to me every single day for 5 years. Beatrice attempted to step in her face, stretched into a desperate, placating smile. Now, Andre, let us not overreact, she cooed, stepping forward with her hands raised in a calming gesture. We are a family. Families support one another during economic downturns. Harrison was going to return the capital with interest once the commercial market rebounded. We just kept it quiet because we did not want to burden you with the stressful details. You did not want to burden me, Andre said, his eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits. You did not want me to know that you are completely broke. The silence that followed was deafening. The wealthy, sophisticated facade that Beatrice and Harrison had weaponized against me for my entire life was actively crumbling to dust right in front of them. Andre was not just putting together the financial fraud. He was realizing the deeply personal betrayal that underpinned his entire existence within this family. He looked at Courtney, his expression shifting from shock to a profound, sickening realization. You did not marry me because you loved me, he said, his voice dropping to a devastated whisper. You married me because your family was drowning in debt. You brought me into this family to be your blind ATM. You needed my firm's capital to maintain this pathetic illusion of wealth and keep your father out of federal bankruptcy court. Every holiday dinner, every anniversary, every time you told me I was the best thing that ever happened to you, it was all just a transaction to keep the money flowing. Harrison slammed his fist against the back of the leather booth. Do not speak to my daughter that way, he barked, puffing out his chest in a last-ditch effort to assert dominance. You are a part of this family, and you will show some respect. We gave you access to high society circles you never would have reached without our name. Your name is entirely worthless, Harrison. Andre shot back, his voice slicing through the air like a razor. Your properties are highly leveraged empty shells, and you just spent the last 5 years committing grand larceny to keep the lights on. Courtney could see her entire glamorous life slipping through her fingers. The designer clothes, the luxury cars, the endless supply of venture capital money. It was all evaporating right in front of her. She immediately reverted to the only tactic she knew. She burst into hysterical tears, throwing her hands over her face and sinking to her knees right there on the restaurant floor. Andre, please, she wailed, looking up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. I love you. I never meant to hurt you. Daddy told me it was the only way to save the family. They made me do it. And Gwen is just trying to destroy us because she is a jealous, bitter orphan who was never really part of this family. Do not let her win. Please do not look at me like that. I am your wife. We can fix this. Just do not walk away from me. She reached out desperately, grabbing the hem of his tailored tuxedo jacket with both hands, her manicured fingers twisting the expensive fabric. But Andre did not reach down to comfort her. He did not pull her into his arms or offer a single word of forgiveness. He looked down at the woman he had loved, the woman who had spent half a decade robbing him blind, and carefully pried her fingers off his jacket. He took a slow, deliberate step back, his eyes narrowing with a cold, terrifying realization that the life he thought he had was entirely fabricated. Andre did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sheer force of his absolute stillness was far more terrifying than any of Harrison's theatrical outbursts. He looked at Courtney kneeling on the floor of the private dining alcove, and then looked down at the diamond-studded designer handbag resting on the edge of the table. It was a bag he had purchased for her during a trip to Milan. A trip funded by the same accounts she was currently using to launder his money. "Give me your purse," Courtney Andre said. Courtney scrambled backward, clutching the expensive leather to her chest like a shield. "No, Andre, please. You cannot do this. I am your wife. We are building a life together. You are building a real estate portfolio for a man who views me as a walking bank vault." Andre replied, his tone clinical and completely detached. "Hand over the bag, now." When she refused to move, Andre simply stepped forward, reached down and yanked the purse from her grip. He did not care that the wealthy patrons in the adjacent booths were craning their necks to watch. He dumped the contents of the bag directly onto the white linen tablecloth. Makeup compacts, mints, and a heavy gold keychain spilled out alongside a sleek leather wallet. Andre systematically began dismantling her fabricated life. He picked up the heavy platinum corporate cards, snapping them cleanly in half one by one, and dropping the plastic shards onto the Wagyu steak Beatrice had abandoned. He picked up the heavy gold keychain featuring the emblem of a brand new Mercedes-Benz. The same car Harrison had proudly bragged about buying his daughter for her birthday just last week. "I paid for this car through the subsidiary holding company," Andre stated, holding the keys up for Harrison to see. "I am repossessing it effectively immediately. It will be reported stolen if it moves from this parking lot tonight." Finally, he picked up her phone. The top-of-the-line model linked directly to his firm's corporate data plan. He pressed the side button, locked the device with a master administrative code, and slid it into his tuxedo pocket. "You have absolutely nothing," Andre said, looking down at Courtney, who was now openly hyperventilating. "Every single asset you possess belongs to my firm. You have exactly 24 hours to clear your personal belongings out of my house before the locks are changed, and the security detail is instructed to treat you as a trespasser. My legal team will contact you in the morning with the divorce papers and the criminal fraud filings." Harrison's face turned an ugly mottled shade of violet. "You cannot treat my daughter like a common criminal," he roared, taking a threatening step toward Andre. "We are the ones who legitimized you. We brought you into high society. You will regret crossing this family." Andre simply turned his back on him, dismissing the blustering patriarch entirely. He looked directly at me, his eyes filled with a heavy, exhausting realization. "You did your job, Gwen. You did it perfectly. Thank you for showing me the truth before they drained me completely. I will be retaining your firm for a full forensic sweep of my entire network." I gave him a brief professional nod. "It is what I am hired to do, Andre." Beatrice realized the game was entirely over. The venture capital money was gone. The luxury lifestyle was terminated. And most dangerously of all, a highly motivated billionaire now possessed a meticulously documented paper trail of their federal wire fraud. The aristocratic mask completely melted off Beatrice's face, leaving behind the panicked expression of a cornered grifter. "Harrison, we need to leave," Beatrice hissed, grabbing her husband's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. "He knows everything. If we stay here, he will call the police. We need to call the lawyers right now." Harrison opened his mouth to deliver one final threat, but Jonathan took a single calculated step forward. My biological father did not say a word. He simply folded his arms across his broad chest and stared Harrison down with the cold, predatory gaze of a man who had built his own empire from scratch. Harrison swallowed hard, all the remaining bravado draining from his posture. Beatrice bent down and grabbed Courtney by the arm, hauling her golden child up from the floor. Courtney was sobbing uncontrollably, her mascara running down her cheeks in thick black lines as she tried to reach back toward Andre. Beatrice practically dragged her toward the exit, her expensive heels slipping awkwardly against the hardwood. Harrison followed closely behind them, walking with his head down, completely stripped of his usual arrogant swagger. They fled the dining room in absolute disgrace, a pathetic parade of exposed frauds running from the consequences of their own actions. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind them, leaving a profound ringing silence in the private alcove. I let out a long breath I did not realize I had been holding. The crushing psychological weight I had carried for 25 years, the constant need to please people who fundamentally despised me, completely evaporated. I looked at Diana and Jonathan. My mother smiled a quiet, fiercely proud smile, while my father placed a warm, reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Let us get out of here," Diana said smoothly, picking up her clutch. "I believe we have celebrated enough for one evening." The four of us walked out of the restaurant together. The maitre d' practically bowed as we passed, completely ignoring the shattered glass and ruined dinner in our former booth. Stepping out into the cool, crisp night air felt like stepping into an entirely new reality. The heavy humidity of the restaurant was gone, replaced by the sharp, clean breeze blowing off the harbor. We gathered near the valet stand, waiting for our cars to be brought around. Andre stood a few feet away, staring blankly at the city traffic, clearly processing the total destruction of his marriage. I felt a surprising wave of empathy for him. We had both been victimized by the same predatory family. We had both been used. Just as Jonathan's car pulled up to the curb, my phone vibrated sharply in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a frantic text from Courtney or a threatening voicemail from Harrison. Instead, the caller ID displayed a formal governmental seal. It was the State Financial Board, the supreme regulatory agency that oversaw all auditing licenses and financial compliance in the region. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night. They never called after business hours unless it was a catastrophic emergency. I swiped the screen and lifted the phone to my ear. "This is Gwen," I answered, keeping my voice level. Gwendolyn Vance, the voice on the other end, was clipped, bureaucratic, and utterly devoid of warmth. "I am calling from the Emergency Disciplinary Committee of the State Financial Board. We are formally notifying you that your certified forensic auditing license is suspended effective immediately." I froze. The crisp night air suddenly felt like ice against my skin. Suspended, I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. "On what grounds?" "We received an expedited injunction from a superior court judge 15 minutes ago," the official stated. "You are being formally charged with malicious corporate espionage, illegal data manipulation, and unauthorized freezing of corporate assets. You are barred from accessing any financial portals, contacting any clients, or stepping foot inside your firm until a full federal investigation is concluded." The line went dead with a hollow click. I lowered the phone, staring blankly at the dark screen. Harrison had always bragged about his political connections. He had spent decades buying influence, paying off local judges, and funding the campaigns of corrupt state senators to protect his shady real estate deals. He knew he could not beat the financial data I had compiled, so he simply bypassed the truth entirely. Cornered and desperate, he had called in his heaviest political favor to burn my career to the ground before I could officially file the audit. The private elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the sprawling expanse of Diana and Jonathan's downtown penthouse. The space was a masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. It was quiet up here, far removed from the chaotic screaming of the restaurant and the frantic, desperate threats of the family that had raised me. Andre walked straight to the leather sofa and collapsed into it, resting his head in his hands. He looked like a man who had just survived a shipwreck. Diana immediately moved toward a sleek, wet bar, pouring a generous measure of scotch into a crystal glass and handing it to him without a word. He took it gratefully. Jonathan did not stop to rest. He walked directly to a massive oak desk situated in the corner of the living room and tapped a sequence of keys on his computer. The large wall-mounted monitor flared to life, displaying cascading rows of dense encrypted financial data. When that suspension call came through outside the restaurant, I immediately flagged my own legal team, Jonathan said, his voice echoing with absolute authority in the quiet room. "Harrison is a cornered animal, but he is also a predictable one. He used a state senator he has been bribing for a decade to bypass due process and strip your license. He thinks blinding you will stop the audit. He is wrong." Diana walked over to me, her expression shifting from the icy elegance she had displayed at the restaurant to a profound maternal sorrow. She placed her hands gently on my shoulders. "Gwen, we knew about the trust fund," Diana said softly. "We knew they had drained the $3 million we left for your future. But when Jonathan's team started digging into the specific commercial properties Harrison used to hide the theft, they found something else. Something much worse." Jonathan pressed a key on his keyboard, and a series of scanned documents populated the large screen. They were loan origination forms, commercial mortgage agreements, high-yield corporate credit applications. I stepped closer to the screen, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted text. Every single document bore my name, my social security number, my date of birth, and at the bottom of each page was a signature that closely mimicked my own handwriting, but lacked the fluid stroke I always used on the letter G. "They did not just spend your trust fund," Jonathan stated, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "The trust ran dry when you were 17. Harrison's real estate portfolio was already collapsing back then. So the second you turned 18, he used your pristine credit and your stolen identity to take out massive corporate loans. He shackled your name to his dying empire." The air vanished from my lungs. The pristine luxury of the penthouse seemed to tilt wildly around me as the horrific truth locked into place. Suddenly, the darkest, most humiliating years of my life made perfect sense. I remembered sitting in a cramped financial aid office when I was 19, begging for a simple $5,000 student loan to cover my tuition. I remembered the loan officer staring at his computer screen with a mixture of confusion and profound pity before sliding a rejection notice across the desk. I was told I was a high-risk applicant with a catastrophic debt-to-income ratio. I had spent my entire college career scrubbing grease off diner floors until my hands bled. I had worked 3 minimum wage jobs just to afford used textbooks and ramen noodles. I had spent countless nights crying in my tiny unheated apartment, absolutely crushed by the weight of my perceived financial failures. And all the while, Harrison had stood in his lavish kitchen, sipping imported wine and lecturing me on the harsh realities of the real world. He had told me that hard work builds character. He had told me I needed to learn the value of a dollar. I was funding Courtney's European vacations and buying her brand new Mercedes with money he stole under my name. He had actively, intentionally sabotaged my entire future to ensure his biological daughter never had to lift a finger. Andre stood up from the sofa holding his glass of scotch, his eyes fixed entirely on the documents displayed on the monitor. He walked toward the screen, his sharp venture capitalist mind instantly connecting the dots. "Look at the dates on those high-yield credit applications," Andre said, his voice sharp and analytical. "Harrison took out the final round of fraudulent loans in Gwen's name exactly 5 years ago." He turned to look at me, the pieces of the puzzle perfectly aligning. "That was the exact same month Courtney and I got married," Andre continued. "Harrison maxed out your stolen credit capacity, Gwen. He hit a brick wall and the banks were threatening to foreclose. That is why they were so eager to welcome me into the family. I was the replacement capital. When they could no longer bleed your identity dry, they transitioned seamlessly into bleeding my investment firm." The sheer scale of their sociopathy was staggering. They had raised me to be their perfect, obedient scapegoat, and then they had groomed Andre to be their endless supply of cash. They were financial predators wearing designer clothes. Before I could even process the magnitude of the identity theft, a sharp buzzing sound shattered the quiet atmosphere of the penthouse. Jonathan glanced at a security monitor on his desk. "It is the concierge desk downstairs. A courier just arrived demanding immediate entry. He claims he has an emergency legal summons requiring a direct signature." Diana's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Let him up." 2 minutes later, the heavy private elevator doors slid open again. A young courier wearing a damp uniform stepped into the penthouse looking completely intimidated by his surroundings. He held a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. "Gwendolyn Vance," the courier asked, his voice cracking slightly. I stepped forward and took the envelope. I signed his digital pad without a word, and the courier quickly retreated back into the elevator. I broke the red wax seal and pulled out a stack of heavy watermarked documents. The official crest of the State Financial Board was stamped across the top of the first page. "What is it?" Diana asked, stepping to my side. I scanned the dense legal jargon, my heart pounding a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. Harrison had not just suspended my auditing license, he was moving for the kill. "It is an emergency summons for a disciplinary tribunal," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Harrison's pet senator just filed a motion to have me permanently barred from the financial sector. The hearing is tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. If I lose, they will permanently revoke my credentials, seize my personal assets to cover the corporate espionage charges, and refer me to the federal prosecutor for criminal indictment. Harrison was trying to put me in prison for discovering the exact crimes he had committed against me. The mahogany doors of the State Financial Board Tribunal chamber were heavy enough to block out all sound from the outside world. At exactly 9 o'clock the following morning, I walked into the dimly lit wood-paneled room and took my seat at the solitary desk positioned in the center of the floor. Sitting directly across from me, elevated on a raised judicial bench, were 3 board directors. I recognized the man sitting in the center immediately. Director Richard Caldwell. He was a fixture in the local high society circuit, and coincidentally a man who played 18 holes of golf with Harrison every single Sunday at the Platinum Tier Country Club. Harrison was already seated at the complainant table to my right, flanked by a pair of aggressive-looking corporate litigators. He was wearing a conservative charcoal suit and had perfectly arranged his features into the mask of a deeply wounded, heartbroken father. He did not look like a man who had stolen millions of dollars from an orphaned teenager. He looked like a victim. Director Caldwell struck his gavel once, signaling the start of the emergency disciplinary hearing. He gave Harrison a warm, sympathetic nod, before turning a glare of absolute disdain toward me. "We are here to review the emergency injunction filed against Senior Forensic Auditor Gwendolyn Vance Caldwell," stated his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous room. "The charges are malicious corporate espionage, unauthorized manipulation of private financial sectors, and a gross violation of fiduciary duty. Mr. Harrison, the floor is yours to present your evidence." Harrison stood up slowly, letting out a heavy, ragged sigh that deserved an Academy Award. He placed his hands on his table, looking up at the board directors with watery eyes. "Thank you, Director Caldwell." Harrison began, his voice shaking with perfectly manufactured grief. "This is the hardest day of my life. 22 years ago, my wife and I opened our home to an orphaned child. We fed her, clothed her, and tried to give her the same advantages we gave our biological daughter, Courtney. But no matter what we did, Gwen harbored a dark, festering jealousy toward her sister." Harrison paused, pulling a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and dabbing at the corner of his eye. "When Gwen learned that the bulk of our family estate and our commercial real estate business would eventually be left to Courtney, she completely snapped." Harrison continued, weaving his disgusting lie with masterful precision. "She used her high-level security clearance at Sterling and Vance to illegally breach our private corporate servers. She hacked into my commercial property management systems and my daughter's lifestyle brand accounts. She froze our assets in a malicious attempt to extort the family for her cut of an inheritance she never earned." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the desk in front of me. The sheer audacity of his narrative was breathtaking. He was painting me as a bitter, greedy adopted child, throwing a dangerous tantrum over unearned wealth while completely burying the fact that he had been surviving on my stolen identity for nearly a decade. Harrison sat down, and his lead litigator immediately stood up, sliding 3 massive leather-bound binders across the raised bench to the directors. "The evidence of Ms. Vance's corporate terrorism is indisputable," the lawyer announced, tapping the cover of the first binder. "We have provided comprehensive server access logs, IP addresses, and internal routing data. As you will see on page 42, the digital footprint matches Ms. Vance's home network perfectly. Furthermore, we have printed digital authorizations showing the exact commands used to freeze the family's banking portals." The lawyer turned to look at me with a triumphant sneer. "Every single one of those illegal commands bears Ms. Vance's encrypted electronic signature. She left a blatant digital trail proving she deliberately sabotaged my client's companies out of petty personal spite." I watched Director Caldwell flip open the binder. He did not even bother to thoroughly read the documents. He merely glanced at the fabricated electronic signatures and shook his head in performative disgust. The other 2 board members followed his lead, whispering to each other and shooting me looks of profound disappointment. They were eating out of Harrison's hand. The forged digital documents were a brilliant and terrifying trap. Harrison had not just printed fake papers. He had used the very identity he stole from me when I was 18 to fabricate this entire digital footprint. He had used the fraudulent corporate loans tied to my social security number to create fake administrative profiles within his own company. He used my stolen identity to frame me for hacking the very shell companies he built with my ruined credit. It was a perfectly closed loop of corruption, and the old money cronies sitting on the board were eager to slam the lock shut. Director Caldwell closed the binder with a sharp, definitive thud. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "The evidence presented here is absolutely overwhelming," Caldwell stated, glaring down at me with unchecked hostility. "Ms. Vance, your actions are a disgrace to the financial sector. You have weaponized your auditing credentials to carry out a personal vendetta against the generous family that raised you. This board has zero tolerance for corporate extortion." Caldwell picked up his pen, holding it over a stack of official state documents. "We are prepared to sign the immediate and permanent revocation of your certified auditing license," Caldwell announced, his voice dripping with authority. "Furthermore, we will be approving Mr. Harrison's motion to seize your personal assets for financial restitution, and we will be forwarding this entire dossier to the federal prosecutor for criminal indictment." Harrison leaned back in his chair, a smug, victorious smirk finally breaking through his mask of fake grief. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully crushed the only person capable of exposing his massive financial fraud. Director Caldwell looked down at me, his pen hovering over the final signature line. "Before this committee finalizes the revocation and seals your file, do you have any statement to offer in your defense, Ms. Vance?" I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I did not cower. I did not stammer or beg for mercy. I looked directly at Harrison, watching his smug smile falter just a fraction at my absolute lack of fear. Then I turned my eyes up to Director Caldwell and the biased committee preparing to destroy my life. "I did not bring a defense to this hearing, Director Caldwell," I said, my voice ringing through the chamber cold, sharp, and carrying the weight of a loaded weapon. "Because I am not the one on trial today. You are." Director Caldwell slammed his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed through the chamber, but I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with the men attempting to ruin my life. "You are entirely out of order," Ms. Vance, Caldwell barked, his face flushing with indignation. "You will sit down immediately, or I will have security remove you from this tribunal." "I will not sit down, Director Caldwell," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and carrying to every corner of the room. "And I will not allow this board to finalize a license revocation based on fabricated evidence printed on a piece of paper. You brought a static PDF to a digital forensics hearing. It is insulting to my profession, and it should be insulting to yours." I stepped away from the solitary desk and walked directly toward the main presentation console positioned below the raised judicial bench. Harrison's corporate litigators immediately stood up, shouting objections, but I ignored them. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer, pulled out a sleek encrypted flash drive, and slotted it into the primary terminal. I bypassed the room's basic security protocols in 3 keystrokes. The massive monitors mounted on the mahogany walls flickered. The official seal of the State Financial Board vanished entirely, replaced by cascading walls of raw, decrypted data logs. Harrison shifted in his seat. The smug confidence began to drain from his posture as he stared at the glowing green text illuminating the dark room. "A digital signature is nothing more than a superficial stamp," I stated, turning to face the board directors. "Anyone with administrative access to a corporate server can copy and paste a digital signature onto an unauthorized command. But a signature is not proof of origin. Metadata is the proof. Metadata is the indelible fingerprint left behind by every single keystroke, and metadata cannot be forged." I tapped the console keyboard, isolating a specific block of data and enlarging it on the primary screen. "The documents Mr. Harrison just submitted claim that I accessed his network from my personal laptop at my apartment." I continued, pacing slowly in front of the monitors. "But when you run a deep forensic extraction on the source code of those exact freeze commands, the data tells a completely different story." I highlighted a string of numbers in bright red. "This is the IP address that originated the network breach," I announced, pointing to the screen. "It does not belong to me." A simple cross-reference with the regional internet service provider logs proves that this IP address is registered to a luxury estate in the northern suburbs, the exact estate currently occupied by Mr. Harrison's daughter Courtney and her husband Andre. The silence in the chamber was absolute. The 2 litigators sitting next to Harrison suddenly looked distinctly nauseated. Submitting knowingly falsified documents to a state licensing board was a disbarable offense, and they had just handed the board a printed confession. But I was not finished. I tapped another key highlighting a secondary string of alphanumeric characters. Furthermore, every device connected to a network has a unique media access control address, I explained, driving the final nail into the coffin. The MAC address associated with this catastrophic hack does not match my auditing equipment. It is a direct match for a customized rose gold MacBook Pro, a laptop exclusively registered to Courtney. She used her husband's administrative credentials to log into his venture capital network, bypass the security firewalls, and freeze her own father's assets to create a false trail. She framed me to cover up the fact that her entire family is drowning in federal wire fraud. Director Caldwell stared at the massive screens, his mouth slightly open. He was a corrupt man who enjoyed his Sunday golf games with Harrison, but he was not a fool. He was looking at federal-level cybersecurity evidence projected in high definition on the state record. If he ignored this data and revoked my license anyway, he would be tying his own career to Harrison's sinking ship. The federal prosecutors would indict him for collusion before the end of the week. Caldwell swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the screen to Harrison, and then back to me. He picked up his gavel and struck the block once. The emergency injunction is dismissed. Caldwell announced, his voice tight with barely suppressed panic. This board cannot proceed with a revocation based on contested digital origins. The evidence submitted by the complainant is formally rejected. This hearing is adjourned. The two other board members immediately stood up, hastily gathering their briefcases and rushing out the side door, clearly desperate to distance themselves from the fallout. Caldwell did not even look at Harrison as he practically fled from the bench. I stood by the presentation console, feeling a surge of absolute victory. I had beaten them at their own game. I had cleared my name and preserved the license I had sacrificed everything to earn. I looked over at Harrison, fully expecting him to be shouting at his lawyers or throwing a tantrum over his exposed lies. Instead, Harrison started laughing. It was a dark, hollow sound that echoed unpleasantly in the empty chamber. He slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, completely ignoring his panicked litigators who were frantically packing their briefcases. He began a slow, mocking clap as he walked around the defendant table and moved toward me. "Bravo, Gwen," Harrison said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Truly a masterful performance. You always were too smart for your own good. You spent all night digging through the code. You built a bulletproof defense. You saved your precious little license." He stopped a few feet away from me. The mask of the heartbroken father was gone, completely replaced by the ruthless, calculating predator who had stolen my identity when I was just a teenager. "You think you won today because you proved Courtney framed you," Harrison sneered, shaking his head in mock pity. "You are so obsessed with the data that you completely miss the bigger picture. This hearing was never about taking your license, Gwen. This hearing was a distraction." A cold sliver of dread slid down my spine. I kept my face perfectly neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my concern. "While you were locked in this room fighting for your pathetic career, I was making calls," Harrison said, leaning closer. "You thought you could audit my life. You thought you could expose the venture capital money I borrowed from Andre. But you forgot that money buys leverage, and I have spent the last 5 years stockpiling a tremendous amount of leverage." Harrison reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He did not hand it to me. He held it up so I could read the bold black letterhead. It was a corporate transfer of equity agreement. "Andre is a brilliant investor, but he is arrogant," Harrison stated softly. "He built his firm using capital from a consortium of silent partners. Men who only care about returns, not family loyalty. This morning, while you were putting on your little slideshow, I took the remaining capital. I secured under your stolen identity, and I made those silent partners an offer they could not refuse. I bought out their entire equity stake at a massive premium." The floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. The sheer scale of his malice was incomprehensible. He had used the money he stole in my name to fund a corporate coup. Harrison smiled maliciously, his eyes gleaming with absolute triumph. "We own Andre's firm now. And by extension, we own your auditing contract. You're fired." The stainless steel elevator doors of Sterling and Vance Capital parted with a soft ping. It was exactly 8 in the morning on Monday. The financial floor was already buzzing with the low hum of ringing phones and junior analysts running quarterly projections. That productivity ground to an immediate halt as Harrison stepped onto the pristine marble floor of the reception area. He walked like a conquering general leading an invading army. He was flanked by 4 aggressive corporate litigators, wearing matching charcoal suits and carrying thick leather briefcases. Courtney strutted in right behind them holding a completely unnecessary matcha latte. She was wearing a designer trench coat she had clearly purchased specifically for this occasion. She did not even glance at the terrified receptionist sitting behind the front desk. Courtney immediately began pointing her manicured finger at the expensive mid-century modern seating arrangement in the lobby. "Get rid of those leather chairs," she barked at one of the paralegals. "They are entirely too masculine and they clash with my aesthetic. I want velvet sectionals in here by Wednesday morning. And someone fire that receptionist right now. She is staring at me, and I find her energy highly unprofessional." Beatrice trailed at the back of the pack holding her smartphone out at arm's length. She was panning the camera across the floor-to-ceiling windows, showing off the panoramic view of the downtown financial district to her livestream audience. "Good morning, followers!" Beatrice cooed, her voice echoing obnoxiously over the quiet hum of the stunned office. "We are having a phenomenal start to our week. My brilliant husband Harrison has just finalized a major corporate acquisition. We are officially expanding the family portfolio into the venture capital sector. It just goes to show that when you build a legacy on trust and hard work, the universe truly rewards you." I stood inside Andre's expansive corner office watching the circus unfold through the soundproof glass walls. I was calmly folding a stack of verified audit reports and placing them into a standard cardboard banker's box. Andre stood beside his massive oak desk, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. He was methodically packing his personal items. He gently placed a framed photograph of his late grandfather into a leather tote bag. He did not look angry. He did not look defeated. He looked completely untethered from the chaos outside. His posture radiated the cold, calculating energy of a man who was already 10 steps ahead of his enemies. Harrison marched down the central glass corridor, parting the sea of panicked junior analysts and terrified administrative assistants. He wanted them to see him. He wanted every single employee in the building to know exactly who controlled their paychecks and their futures. He threw open the heavy glass door to the corner office without bothering to knock. The 4 corporate lawyers filed in behind him, effectively blocking the exit and sealing us inside. "Well," Harrison said, a wide, predatory smile stretching across his face as he looked at our packed boxes. "It looks like you two already got the memo. I appreciate the efficiency. It saves my private security team the trouble of dragging you both out by your collars in front of your former employees." Courtney pushed her away past the wall of lawyers and stood next to her father. She looked at Andre and let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "You really thought you could just cut me off, Andre," she sneered, taking a slow sip of her latte. "You thought you could freeze my accounts and take my car and humiliate me in front of my family at dinner. Did you honestly believe my father would let you get away with that? You are absolutely nothing without our family name backing you, and now you do not even have your own firm." Courtney turned her attention to the expansive room, running her free hand along the edge of a mahogany bookshelf. "I am taking this office, by the way," she announced. "The natural light in here is perfect for my brand shoots. You can leave the desk, but everything else needs to be cleared out in the next 10 minutes." I continued packing my box, ignoring her completely. I placed my ergonomic mouse and my encrypted hard drives into the cardboard container. The silence in the room was heavy. It was not the silence of defeat. It was the absolute silence of a trap being meticulously set. Every arrogant word falling from their mouths was exactly what we needed them to say. Harrison stepped forward, pulling a heavy gold fountain pen from his breast pocket. He snapped his fingers and his lead attorney immediately handed him a thick stack of termination documents. He slapped the papers down onto Andre's desk, right next to my cardboard box. The heavy thud made the remaining employees outside the glass walls flinch. "We bought out your silent partners on Friday night," Harrison stated, his voice dropping to a harsh, authoritative register. We paid a massive premium to secure 68% of the voting shares. Sterling and Vance Capital is now officially a subsidiary holding of Harrison Commercial Properties. You are both terminated effective immediately for gross financial mismanagement, breach of fiduciary duty, and corporate insubordination. Harrison leaned his knuckles against the polished wood of the desk, invading Andre's personal space. His breath smelled of stale coffee and unearned victory. You thought you were the smartest man in the room, Andre. You thought you could run an audit on my family and face no consequences. But you forgot the golden rule of business. Capital always wins. And I just bought your entire life out from under you. Harrison clicked the gold pen open. He held it out toward Andre with a malicious, sickening smirk. Sign the severance waivers, he ordered, his voice dripping with venom. Hand over your master administrative access codes. You work for me now. I looked at the heavy gold fountain pen resting on top of the crisp white legal documents. The papers were freshly printed, bearing the newly minted letterhead of Harrison Commercial Properties, right alongside the Sterling and Vance logo. He had come prepared for a slaughter. Outside the soundproof glass walls, Beatrice was practically pressing her smartphone against the pane. She was live streaming the entire confrontation to her massive audience, eager to capture the exact moment her husband cemented his status as a corporate titan. Courtney stood right beside her father, her arms crossed over her designer trench coat, looking at me as if I were a stain on the newly acquired carpet. I slowly reached out and pulled the thick stack of papers toward me. I did not pick up the pen. Instead, I flipped through the heavy packet. It was not just a standard termination agreement and administrative handover. It was a comprehensive, ironclad, non-disclosure agreement. The stipulations were entirely draconian. It demanded my absolute permanent silence regarding any financial transactions, internal audits, or corporate communications related to his companies. It required the immediate surrender of all personal hard drives, encrypted files, and forensic software. It was a legal gag order perfectly designed to bury his federal wire fraud forever. I pushed the documents back across the polished mahogany desk. I will not sign a gag order to cover up your felonies, Harrison. Harrison's smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cold reptilian glare. He leaned over the desk, planting both of his hands flat on the wood and bringing his face mere inches from mine. He lowered his voice so that only Andre and I could hear the absolute malice dripping from his words. You are going to sign that document, Gwen. He whispered, his tone sharp and lethal. Because if you do not pick up that pen right now, my next phone call will be to my litigation team. I will file a massive civil suit against your birth parents before noon. My blood ran cold. Diana and Jonathan. Harrison saw the microscopic shift in my expression and seized on it like a predator smelling blood. That is right, he sneered. I know all about your touching little reunion with Diana and Jonathan. I know they live in a modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs. I know Jonathan is 3 years away from collecting his pension. If you refuse to sign this NDA, I will drag them into a prolonged, bankrupting legal war over the initial adoption contract. I will accuse them of violating the original trust terms. I will tie them up in depositions, discovery, and endless appeals for the next 10 years. He leaned even closer, his eyes dead and unfeeling. I will bleed them dry until they lose their house, their retirement funds, and every single dime they have to their names. I have the capital to keep them in court until they break. Courtney stepped up beside her father, an ugly, vindictive grin spreading across her face. You really should listen to him, Gwen, she chimed in, adjusting the collar of her coat. Dad has a team of lawyers on retainer who specialize in ruining people. Do not be selfish. Are you really going to let your real parents become homeless just because you are too stubborn to admit you lost? Poor people simply cannot afford to fight us in court. I stood perfectly still, absorbing the sheer scale of their cruelty. Harrison was using the very people he had stolen me from as collateral to protect his empire. He expected me to shatter under the weight of the threat. He expected me to scream, to rage, or to break down and beg for mercy. He expected the emotional, traumatized orphan he had spent years trying to cultivate and suppress. Instead, I looked at Andre. Andre stood by the window, his face a mask of absolute calm. He gave me a single, barely perceptible nod. I turned my attention back to Harrison. I reached out and picked up the heavy gold fountain pen. The metal was warm from his grip. I uncapped the pen, pulled the thick stack of legal documents back toward me, and flipped directly to the final signature page. I did not hesitate. I pressed the gold nib to the paper and signed my name in sharp, fluid strokes. I signed the severance waiver. I signed the administrative handover. I signed the draconian non-disclosure agreement. Harrison watched the ink dry with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. He let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the glass walls and spilled out onto the financial floor outside. I knew it, Harrison gloated, snatching the papers off the desk and waving them in the air like a championship trophy. I absolutely knew it. You talk a big game, Gwen, but when the pressure is actually applied, you fold like a cheap suit. You are a loser. You were a loser when we brought you into our home, and you are a loser today. He turned to his lawyers, shoving the signed documents into the chest of his lead litigator. File these immediately, he barked. Lock her out of the servers, wipe her administrative profiles, and seize her forensic drives. Harrison turned back to me, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. You actually thought you could beat me, he mocked, shaking his head in faux pity. You thought your little spreadsheets and metadata logs could bring down an empire. But this is the real world. And in the real world, capital dictates the rules. I own your silence, I own your research, and I own this firm. Now take your cardboard box and get out of my building before I have security throw you onto the street. I calmly placed the cap back on the gold fountain pen. I set it down on the edge of the mahogany desk with a soft, definitive click. I did not grab my cardboard box. I did not move toward the door. I looked directly into Harrison's victorious eyes, my expression shifting from neutral into a cold, razor-sharp smile. You are absolutely right about one thing, Harrison, I said, my voice ringing clear and steady through the quiet room. The person who controls the capital dictates the rules. But if you are going to orchestrate a hostile takeover of a venture capital firm, you should really learn to read the standard operating agreements you force your employees to sign. Harrison's booming laugh abruptly cut off. His brow furrowed in confusion. What are you talking about? He snapped. I slid my hand across the desk and tapped my index finger against the thick stack of termination papers his lawyer was holding. Turn to page 12, I instructed him, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Read Section 4, Clause B. Harrison looked down at the paper. He did not want to. His entire body language resisted the command, but the absolute certainty in my voice forced his eyes to the page. He scanned the dense block of legal jargon at the bottom of page 12. I watched the physiological transformation happen in real time. The arrogant, triumphant flush drained from his cheeks in a matter of seconds, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His jaw slackened. The hand holding the heavy gold pen began to tremble so violently that the pen slipped from his grip and clattered against the polished mahogany desk. This is a typographical error, Harrison stammered, his voice suddenly thin and reedy. This clause makes absolutely no sense. It says the operating entity has been vacated. It is not a typographical error, Harrison, I replied, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. It is a legally binding disclosure that you just explicitly agreed to by signing those documents. It clearly states that Sterling and Vance Capital recently underwent a comprehensive corporate restructuring. A perfectly legal, fully documented reorganization that was finalized exactly 72 hours before you initiated your hostile takeover. Harrison looked up at me, his eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying comprehension. What did you do? Andre moved away from the window and stepped up beside me. He looked down at the man who had just tried to ruin him with an expression of cold, clinical detachment. We did exactly what any smart venture capital firm does when they detect a hostile threat. Andre explained, his voice smooth and devastating. We initiated a spin-off. Before you bought out my silent partners, I legally transferred every single liquid asset, every piece of profitable intellectual property, and every active client contract out of this firm. I moved our entire operational portfolio into a brand new privately held holding company. Harrison gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white. You cannot do that. The silent partners would have to approve a transfer of that magnitude. They did approve it, I stated. I showed them the preliminary audit of your commercial real estate business. I showed them the massive federal wire fraud you were hiding. I explained that you were about to use stolen capital to buy them out. They were thrilled to approve the asset transfer because it meant they could take your bloated buyout money today while leaving you holding a completely empty bag. Harrison staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He turned his frantic gaze to the lead corporate litigator who had brought him the documents. The lawyer practically snatched the severance package off the desk, flipping frantically through the pages. The lawyer stopped on page 12, reading the exact clause I had pointed out. The color drained from his face just as quickly as it had from Harrison's. The lawyer slowly lowered the document, looking at Harrison with pure, unadulterated horror. "They gutted the firm," the lawyer whispered, his voice shaking. "You bought a ghost company, Harrison. You just purchased the commercial lease, the office furniture, and the corporate liabilities. There is zero capital left in this entity." "Where did the assets go?" Harrison demanded, pounding his fist against the desk. "Where did you hide the money?" I smiled. A cold, sharp smile that had been building inside me for 22 years. "We did not hide anything," I answered. "We established a new holding company where Andre serves exclusively as an advisory board member. He does not own the new firm. I do not own the new firm. The sole controlling proprietors of that new multi-million-dollar holding company are Diana and Jonathan Vance." Harrison stared at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The sheer poetry of the trap finally dawned on him. He had just threatened to drag my birth parents into a bankrupting legal war. He had threatened to make them homeless. He had no idea that he was threatening the very people who now legally owned the empire he thought he had stolen. "You played yourself, Harrison," I continued, my voice ringing clear and steady through the quiet room. "You leveraged your commercial properties to the breaking point. You took out massive high-interest mezzanine debt to pay off Andre's partners. You spent your last remaining liquid millions to orchestrate this hostile takeover. And you bought a totally empty corporate shell. You are holding tens of millions of dollars in toxic debt with absolutely zero revenue to back it up. You are entirely, completely bankrupt. Furthermore," Andre added, leaning casually against the desk, "because you just forced Gwen to sign a draconian non-disclosure agreement. You cannot legally contest this asset transfer in court without breaking your own gag order and admitting to the extortion and wire fraud that funded your buyout. You locked yourself in a burning building and handed us the only key." The three subordinate lawyers did not hesitate. They realized instantly that their client was destitute and they were never going to see a single cent of their legal fees. They snapped their briefcases shut and practically sprinted for the glass door, abandoning Harrison without a backward glance. Outside on the financial floor, the reality of the situation was bleeding through the soundproof glass. Beatrice was still holding her smartphone out in front of her. She was live streaming the entire interaction. Her viewers could not hear the audio, but they could see the lawyers fleeing. They could see Harrison grasping his chest as he hyperventilated. Beatrice looked down at her screen. The live chat was exploding with comments from rival socialites and local journalists who were already pulling the public filing records of the buyout. Beatrice realized her luxury lifestyle, her country club memberships, and her entire social identity had just evaporated on live television. She dropped her designer handbag. Her hands flew to her face and she let out a visceral, guttural scream that pierced straight through the heavy glass walls. It was the sound of pure materialistic despair. Courtney spun around, staring at her screaming mother and her hyperventilating father. The arrogant smugness was entirely gone from her face. She looked at the empty office she had just tried to claim. She looked at the massive high-interest debt her father had just assumed. Courtney possessed the ruthless survival instincts of a cornered rat. She instantly calculated the blast radius of her father's financial implosion and realized she was standing squarely inside it. She backed away from Harrison, holding her hands up defensively. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at Beatrice, who was still wailing in the lobby. This was Mom's idea. Courtney panicked violently, throwing her own mother under the bus to save herself. "I had nothing to do with this fraud. She forced him to do it to keep up appearances. I have the text messages to prove it." The absolute silence that followed. Courtney's shrieked confession lasted exactly 1 second before the entire facade of the Harrison family violently detonated. Beatrice whipped her head around to stare at her daughter, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure betrayal. The smartphone she had been using to broadcast their supposed triumph lay forgotten on the marble floor. The screen cracked and the live stream still running. "You ungrateful little viper!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "I did everything to secure your lifestyle and you are giving them my private messages." Courtney did not even look at her mother. She recognized that her parents were a sinking ship, and she possessed the predatory instinct to immediately search for a life raft. She dropped her designer matcha latte. The plastic cup hit the floor with a wet slap, splattering green liquid across the pristine white marble and the polished shoes of the fleeing corporate lawyers. Courtney practically threw herself across the room, lunging toward Andre. She reached out with trembling manicured hands and physically clung to the lapels of his tailored navy suit. Her perfectly maintained composure completely collapsed, replaced by a pathetic, desperate panic. "Andre, please," Courtney begged, her voice high and breathless. "You have to listen to me. I had no choice. They made me do it. My father forced me to use your administrative credentials. I never wanted to frame Gwen. I never wanted any of this. I love you, Andre. We can fix this. I will change. I promise you I will change. Just do not leave me with them." Andre did not flinch. He did not yell or display an ounce of the emotional turmoil Courtney was frantically trying to weaponize. He looked down at her grasping hands with the clinical disgust of a man inspecting a parasite. Slowly and methodically, he reached up and detached her fingers from his suit. He stepped back, creating a cold physical boundary between them. "You do not love anyone," Courtney, Andre stated, his voice perfectly level and devoid of any warmth. "You love the platinum credit cards I provided. You love the social status my last name afforded you. And you love the illusion of superiority. But all of that is gone now." Andre reached into the leather tote bag he had packed earlier. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and held it out. When Courtney refused to take it, staring at it as if it were a venomous snake, Andre simply let it drop. It hit the floor right on top of the spilled latte. "Those are divorce papers," Andre informed her, watching her eyes widen in horror. "I filed them on Friday morning, right before I authorized the corporate spin-off. I cited gross financial misconduct, criminal fraud, and marital abandonment. My legal team already fast-tracked the injunctions. You will not see a single cent of my personal wealth." Courtney stared at the envelope, her breathing ragged. "You cannot do this," she hissed, her desperation rapidly morphing into vicious entitlement. "We are married. Half of everything is mine, Andre. The northern suburban estate is mine. The cars are mine. My closet alone is worth a fortune. You cannot just cut me off and leave me with nothing. I will take you for everything you have." Andre let out a short, dry laugh. "That is the tragedy of your situation, Courtney. You really do not pay attention to the details. I do not own the northern suburban estate anymore. I did not just spin off the firm's assets. I liquidated and transferred every single shared marital asset into the new holding company. And because you explicitly signed over your power of attorney to your father so he could manage your supposed trust fund, you gave him total control over your remaining capital." Andre reached back into his tote bag. He bypassed his framed photographs and pulled out a cheap, thin plastic grocery bag. It was the kind of flimsy, crinkling bag you get from a discount corner store. He tossed it at her feet. It landed next to the divorce papers. "Your father needed massive amounts of liquid capital to buy out my silent partners," Andre explained, his voice echoing across the silent financial floor. "To secure that mezzanine debt, he had to leverage everything he controlled. He used his commercial properties, he used his personal bank accounts, and he used your entire luxury inventory as collateral. The bank is currently at the estate repossessing the cars, your jewelry, your designer bags, and every single pair of shoes you own." Courtney stared at the cheap plastic bag, her entire body shaking. "I had my assistant stop by a discount store on the way to the office this morning." Andre continued, ruthlessly dismantling her reality. "Inside that bag, you will find a pair of basic gray sweatpants and a plain white cotton t-shirt. I suggest you put them on, because by the time you leave this building, that plastic bag will represent the entirety of your net worth." Courtney let out a choked, agonizing gasp, dropping to her knees on the marble floor. She stared at the plastic bag as if it were a physical manifestation of her completely ruined life. While Courtney knelt in the spilled latte, staring at her new sweatpants, the lobby behind us erupted into a violent screaming match. Harrison and Beatrice were completely ignoring their daughter's collapse, turning their venom entirely on each other. "This is your fault, you incompetent fool!" Beatrice screamed, stepping into Harrison's personal space and pointing a finger directly in his face. "You told me this was a foolproof plan. You told me buying out the firm would bury the wire fraud. Now we are holding millions in toxic debt. Where is the $3 million trust, Harrison? Where is the money you promised me?" "Do not you dare blame this on me," Harrison roared back, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You are the one who could not stop spending. You are the one who demanded the country club memberships and the luxury vacations to keep up appearances. If you had not been bleeding my accounts dry for the last decade, I would not have needed to steal the girl's identity in the first place. You drove us into this hole, Beatrice." They were viciously tearing each other apart, airing decades of criminal conspiracy and marital rot right in the center of the glass-walled lobby. The junior analysts and administrative staff had abandoned all pretense of working. They were standing openly at their cubicles, watching the titans of the Harrison family publicly immolate themselves. Then a new sound cut through the screaming. It was the sharp, distinct chime of the primary elevator arriving at the executive floor. The heavy stainless steel doors slid open. The rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots echoed against the polished marble lobby. Two federal agents wearing dark navy windbreakers with golden badges gleaming on their chests walked through the glass doors. The heavy thud of tactical boots against the polished marble floor echoed like a death knell through the reception area. The two federal agents moved with a synchronized, terrifying purpose. They wore dark navy windbreakers with bright yellow letters spelling out IRSCI across their backs. The immediate silence that crashed over the lobby was absolute. Beatrice stopped screaming mid-sentence, her mouth hanging open. Courtney scrambled backward away from the spilled matcha latte and the plastic bag of cheap sweatpants, her eyes wide with uncomprehending terror. Harrison wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and quickly attempted to reassemble his shattered billionaire persona. He smoothed the lapels of his charcoal suit and plastered on a sickeningly confident smile. He stepped forward, extending a hand toward the lead agent. "Gentlemen," Harrison boomed, projecting his voice so the entire floor could hear. "I assume you are here regarding the restructuring of this firm. You are just in time. I recently uncovered massive financial irregularities orchestrated by the former management." He pointed a shaking finger directly at the glass walls of the corner office where Andre and I stood. "I demand you investigate them immediately for corporate sabotage." The lead agent did not take Harrison's hand. He did not even look at the corner office. He pulled a heavy folded document from the inside pocket of his windbreaker. "Harrison Vance," he stated, his voice carrying the flat, uncompromising authority of the federal government. "I am Special Agent Miller, with the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. We are executing a federal search and seizure warrant for your person and all affiliated corporate properties." I pushed open the heavy glass door of the corner office and stepped out onto the financial floor. The soft click of the door closing behind me sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Every employee, every junior analyst, and every paralegal watched me walk slowly toward the lobby. I stopped a few feet away from Harrison, looking at him with a cold, detached satisfaction. "You really should have paid closer attention to my resume, Harrison," I said, my voice ringing clear and steady. "I am not just a glorified bookkeeper. I am a certified forensic accountant. When you gave me administrative access to audit your daughter's trust funds, you gave me the thread. And I pulled that thread until your entire fraudulent empire unraveled." Harrison's confident smile completely collapsed. His skin turned a mottled, sickening gray. "What did you do?" he choked out. "I audited your corporate taxes from the inside out," I explained, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "I bypassed your sanitized public ledgers and dug directly into your hidden offshore routing numbers. I found the shell companies you registered in the Cayman Islands. I found the dummy invoices you used to funnel untaxed revenue out of your commercial real estate holdings. I mapped the entire money laundering network you established to dodge federal capital gains taxes over the last 12 years. "You are lying," Harrison stammered, taking a step backward. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw breath. "You have no proof. You have absolutely nothing. My accountants are the best in the country. They covered every track. They left digital footprints everywhere, Harrison. I countered, my tone merciless and precise, and I compiled every single one of them, every illegal wire transfer, every fraudulent tax return, every piece of correspondence instructing your accountants to cook the books. I put it all into a massive encrypted dossier and anonymously forwarded it directly to the IRS. I handed them a fully verified, meticulously documented roadmap to your federal crimes. Agent Miller stepped forward, breaking the tense standoff. We have been reviewing the dossier for the past 72 hours, he confirmed, looking at Harrison with absolute disgust. A federal judge signed off on the warrants this morning. We are not just here to seize your remaining corporate assets, Mr. Vance. We are here to freeze your personal bank accounts, your international holdings, and every single property registered to your name or your subsidiaries. The reality of the situation crashed over the Harrison family like a tidal wave. The bankruptcy had just been the appetizer. This was complete, total annihilation. Beatrice let out a whimpering sob, pressing her hands against her mouth. She backed slowly toward the elevator, desperately trying to physically distance herself from her husband. She realized she was married to a federal criminal whose assets were about to be frozen, leaving her entirely penniless. Courtney was trembling so violently, she looked as though she might shatter. She looked down at the plastic grocery bag containing her cheap sweatpants, finally understanding that those clothes were truly all she had left in the world. Outside the lobby, the financial floor was completely transfixed. Dozens of employees who had spent the morning terrified of losing their jobs to a corporate tyrant were now watching that tyrant face federal prosecution. Several junior analysts had their phones out, openly recording the downfall. On the marble floor, Beatrice's smartphone was still broadcasting the entire scene to thousands of viewers online, capturing the absolute destruction of the Harrison legacy in high definition. Harrison looked at the federal agents. He looked at his horrified wife and his panicking daughter. He looked at the sea of employees watching him with pure, unadulterated contempt. The man who had spent his entire life wielding capital as a weapon suddenly found himself completely disarmed and facing a concrete cage. His mind simply could not process the absolute loss of power. Panic completely overrode his logic. The facade of the untouchable billionaire shattered, revealing the terrified, desperate criminal underneath. Harrison let out a raw, guttural shout. He spun around, his expensive leather shoes slipping wildly on the spilled matcha latte coating the marble floor. He flailed his arms to catch his balance and bolted blindly toward the private executive exit at the back of the lobby. I was running on pure adrenaline, a pathetic, desperate dash for an escape that did not exist. I did not make it 10 feet. The federal agents moved with terrifying, explosive speed. They lunged forward, closing the distance instantly. Agent Miller grabbed Harrison by the shoulder of his tailored charcoal suit and violently spun him around. The second agent swept Harrison's legs out from under him. The billionaire crashed hard onto the polished marble floor, knocking the breath from his lungs with a sickening thud. Before Harrison could even attempt to struggle, the agents pinned his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed loudly through the lobby, cementing his absolute ruin in front of his former employees. Agent Miller hauled Harrison to his feet with a sharp upward jerk. The movement was entirely devoid of the deference Harrison had demanded from the world for the last 4 decades. Harrison stumbled, his expensive leather shoes slipping against the polished marble floor. His tailored charcoal suit was hopelessly wrinkled and stained with the green matcha latte Courtney had dropped. The heavy steel handcuffs clinked against his wrists, a harsh metallic sound that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the room. He twisted his neck, trying to look back at the financial floor. He locked eyes with his senior vice president of acquisitions, a man who had spent 10 years acting as his personal lapdog. Harrison opened his mouth to issue an order to demand that the vice president call the board of directors and arrange a legal defense team. But the vice president simply turned his back and walked toward his cubicle. The absolute silence of the employees was a devastating verdict. Harrison was no longer a titan of industry. He was just a criminal being escorted off the premises. The second agent placed a firm hand on the back of Harrison's neck and marched him toward the executive elevators. As the doors slid shut on the furious, hyperventilating billionaire, Beatrice finally registered the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe. She stood frozen in the center of the lobby. Her smartphone chimed continuously with automated fraud alerts as the federal government systematically froze her platinum credit cards, her offshore trust accounts, and her personal investment portfolios. The digital walls of her aristocratic fortress were crashing down in real time. Panic entirely consumed her. Beatrice looked at the empty elevator bank and then whipped her head around to look at me. The arrogant superior mask she had worn for 22 years melted away, leaving behind a pathetic, terrified shell. She scrambled across the lobby. She did not care that she was wearing a priceless silk skirt. She did not care that she was dragging her knees through the spilled, sticky latte. She threw herself across the final few feet and collapsed directly at my feet. Beatrice reached out with trembling hands and seized the fabric of my trench coat. Her perfectly manicured nails dug desperately into the material. "Gwen, please!" she shrieked, her voice a jagged, hysterical screech that echoed off the soundproof glass. "You have to stop this. You have to call those agents right now and tell them it is a mistake. Tell them you fabricated the audit. Tell them you misread the offshore routing numbers. You can fix this, Gwen." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like a burdensome stray dog. "We are your family, Gwen," Beatrice sobbed, burying her face against the hem of my coat. "We took you in when you had absolutely nothing. We put a roof over your head. We fed you and clothed you and gave you our prestigious name. We loved you like our own flesh and blood. You owe us everything. You cannot do this to your family. I am begging you, Gwen, please do not let them take my home." I did not try to pull my coat away from her desperate grasp. I did not raise my voice. I let her weep, letting the dozens of employees outside the glass walls witness the absolute degradation of the woman who had terrorized them for years. I waited until her frantic sobbing reduced to ragged, breathless gasps. Then I leaned down, bringing my face level with hers. "You do not understand the definition of family, Beatrice," I stated, my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of warmth. "Family is not a financial transaction. Family is not a public relations stunt you use to impress your country club friends." Beatrice looked up at me, her mascara running down her cheeks in thick black rivers. "I remember my 30th birthday, Beatrice." I continued, my words slicing through her panic like a scalpel. "I remember standing in the kitchen of your estate. I remember you cornering me after the guests left and telling me that adopting me was the biggest regret of your life. You told me I was nothing but a living, breathing tax write-off. You told me I was a charity case you only kept around because it made for good corporate publicity." Beatrice gasped, her eyes widening in horrific recognition. She opened her mouth to deny it, to formulate another desperate lie, but the sheer coldness in my eyes stopped her dead. "I am not acting out of malice, Beatrice," I whispered, keeping my gaze locked onto hers. "I am simply following the exact rules you taught me. I am only cutting you out because you are no longer useful." Beatrice physically recoiled, as if I had driven a blade directly into her chest. Her hands went slack, releasing my trench coat. She slumped backward onto the marble floor, her mouth opening and closing in silent, devastated shock. She finally understood that there was no mercy left to extract. I straightened my posture and stepped around her weeping form. Andre was waiting for me near the central glass corridor. He held out his arm and I took it. We did not say another word to the broken women on the floor. We turned our backs on the Harrison family and walked side by side toward the exit. The employees parted for us, creating a wide path to the doors. It was a silent sea of profound respect. We stepped into the main elevator, and the stainless steel doors slid shut, severing us completely from the toxic wreckage of my past. Back in the lobby, Courtney was left standing entirely alone. She stared at her mother sobbing on the floor. She looked at the empty elevator where her father had just been hauled away in handcuffs. She looked down at the cheap plastic grocery bag dangling from her fingers containing the gray sweatpants Andre had given her. Her husband had served her with divorce papers. Her father was facing federal prison. Her mother was utterly destitute. The designer world she had brutally defended had vanished in the blink of an eye. But as Courtney looked at the devastation around her, the shock did not evolve into remorse. It did not morph into sadness or accountability. Instead, a hot, venomous rage boiled up in her chest. She refused to accept defeat. She refused to be the victim of my success. She dropped the plastic bag onto the floor. The cheap crinkling sound was the only noise in the immediate area. Courtney reached into the pocket of her trench coat and pulled out her smartphone. Her hands were shaking violently, but she gritted her teeth and scrolled furiously through her contacts. She bypassed her friends, her stylists, and her socialites. She stopped on the name of a notorious sleazy tabloid reporter named Dex Callahan. Dex made a highly lucrative living destroying reputations and publishing fabricated corporate scandals for the highest bidder. Courtney hit the dial button and lifted the phone to her ear. Her eyes narrowed into dark, spiteful slits as she stared at the empty space where Andre and I had just been standing. "Dex," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, calculated whisper as soon as he answered the line. "I have an exclusive explosive headline for you. It is about Sterling and Vance Capital. I have absolute undeniable proof that Andre Vance and his new partner Gwen orchestrated a massive corporate fraud scheme to illegally seize my family's assets. I will give you all the fabricated internal emails and financial documents you need to publish the story today. But you have to pay me exactly $200,000 in cash by midnight. We are going to burn them both to the ground." 3 weeks after Harrison was hauled out of his own corporate lobby in heavy steel handcuffs, the atmosphere inside the grand ballroom of the Astor Hotel was a masterclass in untouchable elegance. The annual City Charity Gala was the undisputed pinnacle of the downtown social calendar. Hundreds of the city's most influential elites sat at tables draped in heavy white silk, conversing quietly over plates of seared scallops and crystal flutes of imported champagne. For the last 10 years, this specific room had been Harrison and Beatrice's absolute domain. They had always occupied the center table, holding court like royalty, while dictating the social hierarchy of the entire city. Tonight that center table belonged entirely to us. I sat perfectly relaxed in a midnight blue evening gown, feeling a profound sense of closure. Beside me sat Diana and Jonathan. My birth parents did not look out of place among the billionaires and politicians. Jonathan wore a tailored tuxedo with a quiet, dignified ease, while Diana radiated a warm, steady grace that commanded absolute respect from everyone who approached our table. They were not the helpless, vulnerable suburban victims Harrison had threatened to bankrupt and crush. They were the legally recognized proprietors of the Vance Foundation, a philanthropic juggernaut that was currently funding the charity's new pediatric research wing in full. Andre sat on my right, looking impeccably sharp and radiating the serene, calculating energy of a man who had successfully excised a malignant tumor from his life. The evening was proceeding with flawless precision. The charity director, a distinguished older woman in a silver gown, stood at the podium, illuminated by a single warm spotlight. She was midway through a heartfelt speech detailing the extraordinary financial contributions our newly established holding company had pledged to the city. The applause was deafening. It was a complete public validation of our victory and a permanent erasure of the Harrison legacy. But the absolute perfection of the moment was about to be violently interrupted. At the far end of the ballroom near the heavy oak service doors, a sudden commotion rippled through the catering staff. 2 private security guards stationed at the entrance stepped forward, holding up their hands to block an incoming threat. They were completely unprepared for the sheer manic desperation of the woman barreling toward them. Courtney shoved her way through the heavy wooden doors, violently knocking a tray of champagne flutes out of a waiter's hands. The crystal shattered across the marble floor with a sharp, jarring crash that made the back rows of the audience turn their heads in alarm. Courtney did not look like the perfectly curated, arrogant heiress who had sneered at me in the corporate office 3 weeks ago. Her blonde hair was visibly unwashed and pulled back into a frantic, messy knot. She was wearing a cocktail dress that was not only 3 seasons out of date, but visibly wrinkled, a stark physical manifestation of her complete financial ruin. The bank had seized everything, and it showed. Her eyes were wide, wild, and completely unhinged. Right on her heels, practically stepping on the hem of her dress, was Dex Callahan. The sleazy tabloid reporter stood out like a sore thumb in the sea of black tie attire, wearing a cheap gray suit and an aggressively bright red tie. I was not holding a discreet smartphone. He was wielding a heavy professional broadcasting rig with a blindingly bright LED attachment and a flashing red recording light. He was panning the lens across the shocked faces of the wealthy donors, live streaming the entire invasion directly to his network of trash-hungry subscribers exactly as Courtney had promised him. "You cannot stop me!" Courtney shrieked, shoving one of the security guards backward with a surprising burst of feral strength. "I am on the guest list. My family built this charity. Get your hands off me." The sheer volume of her screech sliced through the elegant ambiance of the ballroom. The polite murmurs of the elite crowd instantly died away, replaced by shocked gasps and horrified whispers. Hundreds of heads swiveled toward the back of the room, watching the disgraced former socialite marching down the central aisle like a woman marching to an execution. Dex kept the camera trained squarely on her, capturing every second of her manic descent, while muttering dramatic commentary into his lapel microphone. I did not flinch. I did not avert my gaze. I sat perfectly still, resting my hands on the silk tablecloth, and watched her approach. Andre casually picked up his champagne flute and took a slow, deliberate sip, entirely unbothered by his estranged wife's public meltdown. Diana placed a calming hand over Jonathan's wrist, silently signaling him not to intervene. We were not going to give her the satisfaction of a panicked reaction. Courtney locked eyes with me from 30 feet away. The sheer toxic jealousy contorting her face was almost palpable. She saw me sitting in the exact chair she believed was her absolute birthright. She saw the respect, the wealth, and the untouchable stability that had been entirely stripped away from her own life. The visual confirmation of my success poured absolute gasoline on her desperation. She was cornered, she was broke, and she was publicly humiliated. She desperately needed her $200,000 payout from Dex, and she knew the only way to get it was to create a viral, catastrophic spectacle. She did not stop at our table. She realized instantly that screaming at me from the floor would not give her the leverage or the audience she required. A localized argument could be contained by the approaching security guards. She needed the entire room, she needed the microphone. Courtney bypassed our table, completely ignoring the second wave of security guards sprinting down the side aisles to intercept her. She kicked off her cheap, scuffed heels, leaving them discarded on the carpet, and sprinted the final few yards to the front of the room. Her bare feet slapped loudly against the polished wooden steps of the stage. The charity director froze at the podium, her eyes wide with utter shock as the manic, disheveled woman charged up the stairs. The director took a hesitant step backward, raising a hand in defense as the blinding light of Dex's camera rig illuminated the stage. Courtney did not slow down. She violently shoved past a massive arrangement of white orchids, sending the heavy porcelain vase crashing off the stage and shattering onto the floor below. She lunged forward with both hands, her face twisting into a furious, desperate snarl. Courtney stormed the stage and violently grabbed the microphone directly from the charity director's trembling hands. The piercing screech of audio feedback ripped through the Astor Hotel ballroom as Courtney violently wrenched the microphone from the charity director's hands. The older woman stumbled backward in sheer shock, her silver gown catching on the podium. Several high society matrons in the front row physically flinched, covering their ears against the harsh electronic squeal. Dex Callahan immediately flanked Courtney. He hoisted his heavy camera rig onto his shoulder, the blinding LED attachment bathing Courtney in a harsh, unforgiving glare. He was practically vibrating with excitement, muttering rapid-fire commentary into his lapel microphone, narrating the scandalous spectacle live to his thousands of trash-hungry subscribers. Courtney stood at the center of the stage, breathing heavily. She looked down at the sea of bewildered billionaires, politicians, and philanthropists. Then she locked her wild, manic eyes entirely on me. "Look at her!" Courtney screamed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers. "Look at the woman who destroyed my life." She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at our table. Tears began to stream down her face, a masterful display of weaponized victimhood. She gripped the microphone with both hands, knuckles turning white as she launched into a hysterical, perfectly calculated monologue. "You all sit here clapping for her," Courtney cried out, her voice cracking with manufactured heartbreak. "You applaud her and Andre for their generous donations. But you do not know the truth. You do not know that the money they are flaunting tonight was stolen from my family." Gwen is not a savior. She is a calculating, manipulative parasite. A collective shocked gasp rippled through the grand ballroom. Hundreds of the city's most powerful elites leaned forward, completely transfixed by the unfolding drama. This was the exact kind of high society bloodsport they lived for. The clinking of silverware stopped entirely. She came into our firm pretending to be a loyal employee. Courtney sobbed, pacing the stage like a wounded animal. But she was quietly orchestrating a massive illegal corporate coup. She seduced my husband. She turned Andre against me, against my family. They fabricated a web of financial lies and fed them to the federal government. They framed my father. A man who spent 4 decades building this city and supporting charities just like this one is now sitting in a concrete federal cell because of her lies. Courtney paused, wiping a tear from her cheek, perfectly playing the role of the devastated daughter and the betrayed wife. Dex Callahan circled her, capturing her weeping profile from every conceivable angle. They froze our assets, Courtney continued, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper of pure devastation. They left my mother completely destitute. They threw me out into the street. They stole my legacy, my husband, and my home. And now they are sitting here smiling, pretending to be philanthropists with my father's money. They are corporate criminals. They belong in prison. The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of frantic whispers. Several prominent board members seated near the front cast suspicious sideways glances at our table. The narrative Courtney was spinning was wildly defamatory, but dangerously effective. In a room full of people who fiercely guarded their wealth, the idea of a rogue employee orchestrating a hostile financial takeover to steal a family fortune hit a very specific nerve. Through it all, I did not move a single muscle. I did not stand up to defend myself. I did not shout back. I did not engage in the chaotic screaming match Courtney so desperately wanted. Engaging with her would only legitimize her hysteria and give Dex Callahan exactly the kind of viral confrontation he needed to cash his paycheck. Instead, I remained perfectly seated. Andre casually leaned back in his chair, resting his hand warmly over mine. His face was a mask of cold, clinical amusement. Diana and Jonathan watched the woman on stage with the detached observation of scientists studying a fascinating insect. We presented an impenetrable united front of absolute calm. Courtney saw my lack of reaction and it infuriated her. She opened her mouth, taking a deep breath to launch into another vicious wave of accusations. She never got the chance. I casually turned my head toward the elevated audio-visual booth suspended at the back of the grand ballroom. I had anticipated that Courtney or her father's lingering loyalists might attempt to disrupt this evening. I had spent the afternoon ensuring we possessed the ultimate contingency plan. I locked eyes with the lead AV technician behind the glass panel. I gave him a single sharp nod. Instantly, the massive dual projector screens flanking the main stage went completely pitch black. The sudden shift in ambient light caused the audience to murmur in confusion. Courtney, too absorbed in her own performance, did not immediately notice the change behind her. She gripped the microphone tighter, preparing to speak again. Then the enormous screens roared back to life. They did not display the charity's gold-leafed logo. They displayed 2 distinct high-resolution feeds that illuminated the entire ballroom with undeniable explosive truth. On the left screen, the display showed a scrolling live feed of Courtney's private text messages downloaded directly from the corporate servers her father had foolishly thought were secure. The text was magnified to massive proportions, making the words easily legible to every single person in the room. The messages were directed to her socialite friends, sent during previous years of this exact same charity gala. Look at these pathetic, desperate losers begging for our money. One massive text bubble read, sent directly from Courtney's number. I only come to this boring gala to watch these tacky new money frauds pretend they belong in our circle. I am going to write a tiny check just to make the director cry. The atmosphere in the ballroom instantly violently shifted. The wealthy donors who had just been feeling sympathy for the weeping woman on stage were now staring at a 50-foot projection of her viciously mocking them behind their backs. The shock in the room transformed into immediate visceral outrage, but the right screen was far more devastating. The right screen displayed the unsealed federal court documents from the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Justice. The headers featured the unmistakable official seals of the federal government. Highlighters slashed across the text outlining the precise nature of Harrison Vance's crimes. The screen broadcasted the undeniable proof of his offshore shell companies. It showed the exact ledgers where he had committed massive wire fraud. It detailed the multi-million-dollar tax evasion schemes. At the very bottom, in bold, undeniable print, was the final federal judgment, confirming Harrison's absolute guilt and the legal seizure of all associated assets due to criminal racketeering. Courtney finally turned around. She looked up at the massive screens looming over her. The fake tears instantly dried on her face. The microphone slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the wooden stage with a loud, jarring thud. Her defamatory lies, her victimhood, her desperate ploy for a massive tabloid payout. All of it was completely publicly incinerated in front of the most powerful people in the city. The heavy thud of the dropped microphone echoed through the cavernous ballroom, vibrating against the crystal chandeliers and sinking deep into the chest of every person present. The silence that followed was no longer born of surprise. It was a thick, suffocating silence of collective absolute revulsion. Above Courtney, the 50-foot projections continued to glow with undeniable damning clarity. On the left, the wealthy elite of the city read exactly what the Harrison heiress thought of them. The women in the front row, the very philanthropists Courtney had just begged for sympathy, stared up at her digital words, calling them tacky new money frauds and desperate losers. On the right, the unsealed federal indictments from the Department of Justice rested like a tombstone over her father's legacy, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that her entire life had been funded by criminal racketeering. Courtney stood barefoot on the polished wooden stage, completely paralyzed. She looked out at the sea of faces, hoping to find a single sympathetic eye, a single gullible donor willing to buy her fabricated victimhood. Instead, she witnessed the ultimate high society execution. In perfect unspoken unison, the attendees seated at the front tables physically turned their backs to the stage. It started with the charity director, who silently picked up the microphone from the floor, wiped the barrel with her silk napkin, and turned her shoulder to Courtney. The gesture rippled backward through the grand ballroom. Hundreds of the city's most powerful politicians, investors, and socialites shifted in their chairs, presenting Courtney with a solid, impenetrable wall of turned backs. It was a synchronized social freeze out of visual confirmation that she had been permanently, unconditionally excised from their world. Behind her decks, Callahan suddenly grasped the catastrophic magnitude of what he had just done. The sleazy tabloid reporter stared at the right projector screen, his eyes scanning the official federal seals of the IRS and the DOJ. He was a bottom feeder, but he possessed a sharp survival instinct regarding libel laws. He realized with a sickening jolt that he had just partnered with a disgraced heiress to live-stream a wildly defamatory, unverified attack against legitimate billionaires and federal prosecutors. Dex did not say a word to Courtney. He violently wrenched the recording equipment off his shoulder, his fingers frantically stabbing at the digital interface. He deleted the live feed. He deleted the local storage. He deleted the cloud backup. He wanted absolutely zero digital trace, tying him to Courtney Vance's psychotic public meltdown. He shoved the camera into his duffel bag, zipped it shut, and practically sprinted down the side aisle of the ballroom, abandoning her on the stage without a backward glance. Courtney watched her only remaining ally flee for the exit. Her chest heaved as panic truly set in. She opened her mouth to shout after him, to demand he keep filming, but no sound came out. The security team, no longer hesitant or confused, moved with absolute authority. 4 massive guards dressed in identical black suits ascended the stage stairs in perfect synchronization. They did not ask Courtney to leave. They did not negotiate. They converged on her instantly. "Get your hands off me!" Courtney finally shrieked, her voice a jagged, hysterical tear in the silent room. "Do you know who I am? I am a Harrison. You work for me." The guards did not blink. 2 of them seized her by the upper arms, hauling her completely off her feet. Courtney immediately went feral. She thrashed wildly, kicking her bare feet through the air and clawing desperately at the guards' wrists. Her outdated cocktail dress bunched up around her thighs as she writhed, her carefully arranged hair falling into her face in a sweaty, tangled mess. "Let me go!" she screamed, twisting her neck to glare at our table as they dragged her toward the heavy oak service doors. "You stole my life, Gwen. You stole everything." I remained perfectly still, sitting beside Andre, Diana, and Jonathan. We did not turn around. We simply listened to her frantic, desperate shrieks echoing down the long marble corridor outside the ballroom, growing fainter and fainter as the guards physically carried her through the service exit and forcefully deposited her onto the cold, wet concrete of the rainy street outside. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing the Astor Hotel and permanently locking Courtney out in the cold. Inside the ballroom, the tension evaporated like mist. The charity director stepped back up to the podium, taking a deep, steadying breath. She adjusted her silver gown and looked directly at our table. "Ladies and gentlemen," the director said, her voice ringing with renewed strength and unshakable dignity, "let us direct our attention back to the true purpose of tonight. We are here to build a future for children who desperately need our help. And we are profoundly honored to do so with the unwavering, generous support of the Vance Foundation." She looked at me and offered a deep, respectful nod. The entire ballroom rose to their feet. The applause started at the front tables and rapidly swelled into a thunderous, deafening roar. It was not just polite clapping, it was a massive standing ovation. They were applauding the charitable donation, but they were also applauding the quiet, absolute grace with which we had handled a vicious public ambush. I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my midnight blue gown. Andre stood beside me, wrapping a warm, protective arm around my waist. Diana and Jonathan flanked us, beaming with profound pride. We stood united in the center of the room, surrounded by the blinding flash of society photographers, capturing the undisputed triumph of our new legacy. The dust settled overnight, washing the city clean. The next morning, the atmosphere inside my new corner office at Vance Capital was a portrait of serene, absolute power. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, illuminating the expansive mahogany desk, the sleek modern furniture, and the framed architectural blueprints of our upcoming philanthropic projects. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, sipping a cup of black coffee and reviewing the preliminary acquisition reports for the quarter. The air smelled of expensive espresso and crisp, clean paper. The chaotic screaming of the previous night felt like it had happened in another lifetime. A soft knock broke the silence. My executive assistant pushed open the heavy glass door, holding a silver mail tray. She looked slightly nervous, her eyes darting toward the single item resting on the polished metal surface. "Good morning, Gwen," she said, her voice hushed. "The mailroom just sent this up. It was flagged as highly urgent. It arrived via certified courier directly to your personal attention." I set down my coffee mug and took the tray. Resting on the silver platter was a thick, stiff envelope. It was not printed on standard corporate stationery. The paper was cheap and rough to the touch. In the upper left corner, stamped in harsh black ink, were the official seals of the Federal Bureau of Prisons and the State Penitentiary. I picked up the envelope, running my thumb along the jagged edge of the seal. The return address was entirely handwritten, scrawled in a frantic, desperate cursive that I instantly recognized. It was from Harrison Vance. I reached for the silver letter opener on my desk and sliced through the thick paper, pulling out a single handwritten page. Harrison did not want to threaten me. He did not want to rage against his federal incarceration. Harrison wanted to make a deal. The visitors' room at the state penitentiary was a masterpiece of sterile, unforgiving concrete and reinforced steel. It was a violent contrast to the silk-draped tables and crystal chandeliers of the Astor Hotel. I sat in a hard plastic chair, breathing in the sharp chemical scent of industrial bleach and floor wax. On the other side of the thick, smeared plexiglass, a heavy steel door clanked open. Harrison shuffled into the booth. The sight of him was genuinely jarring. In just a few months, the federal justice system had stripped away every single layer of his untouchable corporate armor. He looked as though he had aged a full decade. The tailored Italian suits and the ever-present scent of expensive imported cigars were completely gone. He wore an ill-fitting bright orange jumpsuit that hung loosely off his diminishing frame. His silver hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning and unkempt. His skin was pale and deeply lined, mapping the sheer terror of a man who had suddenly plummeted from the pinnacle of society to the absolute bottom of the food chain. He sat down heavily and picked up the heavy black receiver. I picked up mine, mirroring his movement, but absolutely nothing else. I sat with my spine perfectly straight, radiating a quiet, untouchable calm. Gwen, he rasped, his voice a desperate dry scrape through the crackling audio connection. You came. I knew you would come. I did not say a word. I simply watched him, letting the silence stretch out and suffocate him. I am dying in here, Gwen, he pleaded, pressing his palm against the scratched plastic divider. The lawyers are draining me dry. The feds seized everything. They froze the offshore accounts. The public defenders are useless and my appeals are dying on the vine. I need capital. I need the retainers paid. I tilted my head slightly, observing his pathetic performance. You called me here to ask for money, Harrison. After everything you did, you want me to write you a check. I am offering a trade, he said, his eyes darting around the room with a feral, paranoid energy. A vital piece of leverage. If you pay my legal fees and get me transferred to a minimum security facility, I will give you the one thing you have always wanted. I will tell you the dark secret behind your adoption. I will tell you why we really took you in, and what happened with your birth parents before they found you again. It is a secret that changes everything, Gwen. I am the only one who knows the whole truth. He leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging the barrier. Just pay the lawyers, Gwen. Buy the truth. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated freedom. Harrison blinked clearly, completely derailed by my reaction. He had expected curiosity, desperation, or bargaining. He fundamentally failed to understand that the frightened little girl he had manipulated for 2 decades no longer existed. I reached into my designer leather tote bag and pulled out a crisp, glossy 8x10 photograph. I pressed it flat against the thick glass directly in his line of sight. Harrison squinted at the image. It was a photograph of a stunning modern glass-fronted office building in the heart of the financial district. The sleek silver lettering above the double doors read, Vance Sterling Forensic Accounting. Standing proudly in front of the doors were Diana, Jonathan, Andre, and myself. We looked powerful, united, and wildly successful. That is my new firm, I said, my voice smooth and lethal. We specialize in dismantling corporate fraud and tracking hidden assets. We are currently fully booked for the next 2 years. I lowered the photograph, watching the realization slowly drain the remaining color from his face. As for your grand dark secret, I continued, holding his terrified gaze. Diana and Jonathan already told me everything. We spent weeks going through the sealed records with a team of relentless federal investigators. We uncovered every lie you told the adoption agency, every bribe you paid to keep them away, and every single manipulation you used to isolate me. There are no more shadows, Harrison. You have absolutely nothing left to trade. His jaw went slack. The last desperate scrap of leverage he thought he possessed dissolved into dust. I placed the receiver back onto the metal cradle, ending the connection with a sharp, definitive click. No, Harrison screamed, his voice barely audible through the thick security glass. He slammed both of his fists violently against the plexiglass, his face contorting into a mask of pure primal despair. I did not flinch. I did not offer him a single ounce of sympathy. I stood up, smoothed the front of my tailored blazer, and turned my back on him. I walked out of the visitor center, my heels clicking rhythmically against the concrete floor, leaving Harrison to rot in his cell. The total collapse of the Vance empire was a rapid, terrifying spectacle of absolute ruin. The social circles that had once bowed to Beatrice and Courtney turned on them with a vicious, unforgiving speed. High society thrives on wealth, but it violently rejects the stench of federal indictments and public humiliation. Beatrice was stripped of her sprawling estate, her luxury vehicles, and her massive, untraceable allowances. The bank seized the properties, and the federal government liquidated her beloved jewelry collections to pay off the endless mountain of Harrison's restitution fines. Destitute and entirely abandoned by her wealthy friends, Beatrice was forced to face the ultimate indignity. She secured employment at the very same high-end luxury department store where she used to spend her afternoons terrorizing the retail staff. Now Beatrice stood behind a glass perfume counter wearing a mandatory polyester uniform and a stiff name tag. She spent her days spraying paper test strips for wealthy women who purposefully avoided making eye contact with her. She constantly complained to her much younger coworkers, spinning delusional tales of her former grandeur, but they despised her bitter, entitled attitude. She was a ghost, haunting the aisles of her own past, completely trapped in a minimum wage nightmare. Courtney fared even worse. Her dramatic public meltdown at the charity gala had instantly gone viral, but not in the way she had planned. Dex Callahan had deleted his footage, but dozens of other attendees had recorded the massive projector screens displaying her hypocritical text messages and her father's criminal records. Courtney became a national laughingstock overnight. Her lucrative influencer sponsorships were immediately terminated. Brands dropped her like a toxic asset, drowning in massive debt from her unsustainable lifestyle. Courtney was evicted from her luxury penthouse. She was forced to relocate to a cramped, unrenovated studio apartment on the grimy outskirts of the city. The space was barely large enough to hold a bed and a tiny kitchenette. Her phone, which used to ring with invitations to exclusive parties and yacht trips, now only rang with relentless aggressive calls from collection agencies. She spent her days ignoring the pounding knocks on her thin apartment door, completely paralyzed by her total financial ruin. The shared trauma of their downfall did not unite them. Beatrice and Courtney turned on her with a vicious, feral intensity. They blamed each other entirely for the loss of their wealth and status. Their relationship disintegrated into a toxic cycle of screaming matches and bitter accusations, leaving them both completely alienated from the society they had once ruthlessly ruled. The dust of their destruction settled permanently, completely clearing the air for a new era. The narrative shifts, seamlessly sweeping forward exactly 5 years, bringing the timeline directly into the present day. 5 years have passed since that pathetic handwritten letter from the state penitentiary landed on my mahogany desk. I never answered it. Harrison's final desperate attempt to leverage a fabricated dark secret regarding my adoption was met with the exact amount of respect it deserved. I gave him absolute crushing silence. I left him to rot in his maximum security concrete cell, stripped of his tailored Italian suits and expensive imported cigars, completely forgotten by the high society he had once ruthlessly dominated. He had absolutely nothing left to trade, and I had an entire empire to build. I am 35 years old now, and the world I inhabit is entirely of my own meticulous making. The afternoon sun bathes the sprawling green lawn of my private estate in a warm golden hue. The air smells of grilled cedar wood, blooming jasmine, and fresh ocean salt, a stark, beautiful contrast to the sterile, suffocating atmosphere of the Astor Hotel ballroom all those years ago. I stand on the expansive stone patio of my home, holding a crystal glass of imported Pinot Noir, and survey the scene unfolding in my backyard. This is not a gathering of corporate vultures or high society parasites looking to exploit each other for financial gain. This is a gathering of the people who actually matter. This is my real family. At the far end of the manicured lawn, Diana and Jonathan are laughing freely. The heavy shadows of fear and financial ruin that Harrison had violently forced upon them have completely vanished. Jonathan is wearing a comfortable polo shirt, tossing a bright yellow tennis ball across the vibrant grass for my newly adopted golden retriever rescue dog. The dog bounds across the yard, barking joyfully, bringing the ball back to Jonathan, who rewards him with a vigorous scratch behind the ears. Diana stands beside him, her face radiant and unburdened, setting out a massive platter of fresh grilled vegetables on a wooden picnic table. They are the parents I always deserved, and seeing them so profoundly happy fills me with a quiet, unshakable peace. Near the custom outdoor kitchen, Andre expertly flips thick steaks on the massive stainless steel grill. He looks entirely relaxed, wearing a casual linen button-down shirt and designer sunglasses. A far cry from the tense defensive posture he used to carry during his miserable marriage to Courtney. Andre is no longer just a close friend, he is my trusted business partner. Together we built Vance Sterling Forensic Accounting into an absolute industry titan. We took the toxic ashes of his former life and constructed an impenetrable fortress of corporate accountability. We spend our days dismantling financial fraud, exposing shell companies, and tracking hidden assets for international clients, ensuring that men like Harrison never get away with their crimes. We are wildly successful, highly respected, and more importantly, we are completely untouchable. As I watch my real family, enjoying the sunlit afternoon, my mind briefly flashes to the spectacular implosion of the people who tried to destroy us. The fallout had been rapid and deeply satisfying. Beatrice, the woman who once dictated the social hierarchy of the entire city, is now working a minimum wage retail job at the exact same high-end department store she used to shop at. She spends her days standing behind a glass counter, spraying perfume samples for wealthy women who purposefully avoid making eye contact with her. She constantly complains to her much younger coworkers, spinning delusional pathetic tales of her former grandeur, but they absolutely despise her bitter entitled attitude. Courtney suffered an equally devastating reality check. Her carefully curated influencer status was completely obliterated the moment her viral meltdown exposed her father's criminal racketeering. Drowning in insurmountable debt, she was swiftly evicted from her luxury penthouse and forced into a cramped, unrenovated studio apartment on the grimy outskirts of the city. She spends her days ignoring relentless aggressive calls from collection agencies, entirely alienated from the elite society she once ruled. Stripped of their wealth and status, Beatrice and Courtney completely turned on each other. Their relationship disintegrated into a toxic cycle of screaming matches and bitter accusations blaming one another for their absolute ruin. A sudden sharp vibration breaks my train of thought. My smartphone buzzes against the sleek glass surface of the patio table. I set down my wine glass and pick up the device. The caller ID displays a blocked number. I do not answer it. I simply wait for the ringing to stop. A moment later, a voicemail notification appears on the screen, followed immediately by the automated text transcription. I read the transcribed words scrolling across the bright digital display. It is Beatrice. Her voice, usually dripping with arrogance and condescension, is reduced to a pathetic weeping plea. The transcription details her crying, begging for a small temporary loan just to keep her electricity from being shut off. She frantically complains that Courtney refuses to help her, that they are viciously fighting over basic grocery money, and that she has nowhere else to turn. It is the ultimate manifestation of her complete and total defeat. I stare at the glowing screen. 5 years ago, reading a message like this might have provoked a surge of vindictive triumph, or perhaps a lingering flicker of misplaced guilt. But today, sitting in the sunlight of my own spectacular success, I feel absolutely nothing. There is no pity. There is no anger. There is only a profound detached indifference. I do not even press play to listen to the audio of her sobbing. She does not deserve a single second of my time or my emotional energy. I press delete, permanently erasing her pathetic plea from my device and from my life. I set the phone face down on the table, cutting off any further connection to the toxic wasteland of my past. I pick up my crystal wine glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip, and let the rich vintage flavor settle on my tongue. I turn my back on the table and walk out onto the sunlit grass, moving toward the sound of genuine laughter and the warmth of the people who love me unconditionally. The best revenge isn't just taking their money. It's letting them watch you thrive while they drown in the reality they created.